Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found these stories interesting, please help me out by leaving a like and consider subscribing. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off, we have the Bravo poisoning. Balham, London, 1876. The Victorian era is often remembered for its rigid etiquette, its stifling corsets, and its obsession with the macabre. But behind the heavy velvet curtains of the grandest estates, there lived secrets that no amount of social standing could scrub away. In April of 1876, at a sprawling mansion called the Priory in the South London suburb of Balham, a scream broke the silence of the night. A scream that would lead to one of the most sensational and enduring unsolved mysteries in British legal history. This is the story of Charles Bravo, a man who took 55 agonizing hours to die, leaving behind a house full of suspects, each with a motive more chilling than the last. The drama began on the evening of April 18th. Charles Bravo, a 30-year-old barrister with a promising future and a somewhat volatile temperament, sat down for dinner with his new wife, Florence, and her live-in companion, Jane Cox. The atmosphere was reportedly tense. Charles and Florence had been married only 5 months, but the honeymoon phase had long since evaporated, replaced by arguments over money and Florence's previous lifestyle. After a meal of lamb and a few glasses of wine, the trio retired to their respective rooms. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the silence of the Priory was shattered. Charles Bravo rushed from his bedroom to the top of the stairs, clad only in his nightshirt, shouting for hot water. When Mrs. Cox reached him, he was vomiting violently over the banister. He collapsed shortly after, slipping into unconsciousness. When the doctors arrived, they were met with a baffling scene. Charles was in the throes of a catastrophic physical collapse, yet there was no immediate evidence of what had caused it. It wasn't until he briefly regained consciousness that the gravity of the situation became clear. He didn't claim he had been attacked. In fact, he claimed he had taken nothing but a little laudanum for a toothache. But as the hours ticked by and his condition worsened, the medical professionals realized they weren't looking at a simple illness. They were looking at the effects of antimony, a slow-acting, excruciatingly painful metallic poison. For nearly 3 days, Charles Bravo lay dying in his bed, surrounded by the very people who might have wanted him dead. He suffered in silence, rarely speaking, even as his body shut down. On April 21st, he finally succumbed. The subsequent autopsy confirmed the presence of a massive dose of tartar emetic, a form of antimony. The question was no longer what killed Charles Bravo, but who had administered it. To understand the suspects, we have to look at the woman at the center of the storm, Florence Bravo. Florence was not your typical Victorian bride. She was a wealthy widow, having inherited a fortune from her first husband, Alexander Ricardo. But her past was stained with scandal. Before marrying Charles, she had been involved in a high-profile affair with a much older, renowned physician named Dr. James Gully. At the time, such an association was enough to ruin a woman's reputation forever. Charles Bravo was well aware of this history, and he used it as a weapon. He was a man of modest means who had married into Florence's wealth, yet he sought to control every aspect of her life. He was reportedly tight-fisted, demanding, and possessed a mean streak that often left Florence in tears. He had even forced her to break off all contact with Dr. Gully, a demand that sat heavily in the air of the Priory. Then there was Jane Cox, the companion. Mrs. Cox was more than a servant. She was Florence's confidant and protector. She was also a woman whose position depended entirely on Florence's goodwill. If Charles succeeded in isolating Florence, or worse, if he followed through on his rumored threats to send Mrs. Cox away back to her family in Jamaica, she would be destitute. On the night of the poisoning, it was Mrs. Cox who first reached Charles. It was Mrs. Cox who provided the initial, conflicting accounts of what he had said in his final moments. The first inquest into Charles's death was a brief, almost perfunctory affair. The jury returned an open verdict, meaning they couldn't determine how the poison had been administered. But the public and the press weren't satisfied. The Balham mystery became a national obsession. Rumors swirled of secret pregnancies, hidden bottles of poison, and a jilted lover lurking in the shadows. Under immense pressure, a second inquest was launched, one that would become the most expensive and publicized inquiry of its kind. The second inquest turned into a trial of Florence Bravo's character. Every detail of her affair with Dr. Gully was dragged into the light. The elderly doctor himself was called to the stand, forced to admit to the relationship that had once been his private shame. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage to a cruel man, a woman who still harbored feelings for her former lover and who had the means and the motive to remove the obstacle standing in her way. Florence's defense, however, offered a different theory: suicide. They argued that Charles, perhaps overwhelmed by the discovery of further details of Florence's past, or perhaps suffering from a fit of jealous rage, had taken the antimony himself to frighten her or to end his own misery. But the suicide theory had one major flaw. Antimony is a terrible way to die. It is slow, it is messy, and it causes immense physical agony. It is not the choice of someone looking for a quick or clean exit. Furthermore, Charles had shown no signs of suicidal ideation in the days leading up to his death. He had been making plans for the future, including buying a new horse and arranging for a dinner party. As the inquest progressed, the spotlight shifted toward Jane Cox. It was revealed that she had been seen disposing of rubbish shortly after Charles fell ill. She had also made several curious statements to the doctors, suggesting that Charles had admitted to taking poison because of his jealousy over Dr. Gully. Yet, no one else had heard this confession. Was Mrs. Cox protecting Florence, or was she protecting herself? Some theorized that she had acted alone, fearing her own dismissal from the household. Others suggested a conspiracy between the two women, a silent pact to rid themselves of the man who threatened their security. But there was a third player in this grim game, Dr. James Gully. While he wasn't at the Priory on the night of the poisoning, he was a man who knew his way around chemicals. Antimony was a common element in the medicinal kits of the era, often used in small doses to induce vomiting. Could he have provided the poison to Florence? Or could his resentment at being cast aside by the woman he loved have driven him to a more direct form of vengeance? The inquest explored these possibilities, but the evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Florence Bravo, dressed in deep mourning black, became a figure of both pity and scorn. She was a woman who had dared to live outside the boundaries of Victorian morality, and for that, the public seemed ready to believe her capable of anything. Yet, through weeks of grueling testimony, no smoking gun was ever found. No one could prove how the antimony got into Charles's water carafe. No one could prove who had purchased the poison. The jury's final verdict reflected the ambiguity of the case. They concluded that Charles Bravo had indeed been murdered by the administration of antimony, but they added a chilling caveat. There was insufficient evidence to fix the guilt upon any specific person. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed. In the eyes of the public, however, the verdict was a failure. Florence Bravo walked free from the court, but she was a broken woman. Her reputation was in tatters. Her fortune was depleted by legal fees, and she was shunned by the society she had once belonged to. She retreated to a quiet life in South Sea, where she eventually drank herself to death just 2 years later, at the age of 33. Jane Cox disappeared into obscurity, her role in the tragedy forever debated by armchair detectives. Dr. Gully's career was ruined. He lived out his remaining years in a state of professional and social exile. Over a century later, the Bravo case remains a staple of true crime literature. Theories continue to proliferate. Was it Florence, the trapped wife? Was it Mrs. Cox, the loyal but desperate companion? Was it Dr. Gully, the jilted lover? Or was it, as some more recent researchers have suggested, a tragic accident? Perhaps Charles had been self-medicating for a condition he was too embarrassed to admit, and he simply took too much of a dangerous substance? One of the most compelling modern theories suggests that Charles Bravo might have been poisoning Florence. He was known to be controlling and was frustrated by her failings as a wife. Some believe he was administering small doses of antimony to her to keep her weak and compliant, and that on that fateful night, He accidentally ingested the poison intended for her. It would explain why the poison was in the house, and why he was so hesitant to admit what he had taken. Another theory points back to the disgruntled staff. Charles was famously disliked by the servants at the priory. He had recently sacked the coachman, a man named George Griffiths, who reportedly held a deep grudge. Griffiths had access to the stables, where antimony was commonly kept to treat horses' coats. Could a vengeful ex-employee have slipped the toxin into Charles's bedside water? The priory still stands today, a silent witness to the events of 1876. The rooms where Charles Bravo spent his final, agonizing hours have been renovated and repurposed, but the mystery of his death still lingers in the halls. It is a story of Victorian repression, of the lengths people will go to protect their secrets, and of a crime so perfectly executed, or perhaps so perfectly obscured, that the truth died along with its victim. Charles Bravo's last words were reportedly, "I have taken some poison for my own purposes. Don't tell Florence." Whether this was a confession of suicide, a desperate lie to protect his dignity, or a coded message we still haven't decoded, we will never know. He took the secret of his death to the grave, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion that has outlived everyone involved. Next story, the Chowchilla School Bus Kidnapping. Chowchilla, California, 1976. In the small town of Chowchilla, July 15, 1976, felt like every other Thursday. It was the final week of summer school at Dairyland Elementary, and for 26 children, the afternoon meant one thing: the bus ride home. Ed Ray was a man who embodied the reliability of the town itself. At 55 years old, he had been driving buses for 26 years. He knew every turn, every pothole, and every child on his route. As he pulled the big yellow bus out of the school parking lot around 4 p.m., the atmosphere inside was typical end-of-day chaos. The kids ranged in age from 5 to 14, sticky from the heat and eager for the weekend. The bus was traveling down Avenue 21, a lonely stretch of road flanked by cornfields, when Ed saw something unusual. A white van was parked squarely in the middle of the pavement, blocking both lanes. Ed slowed the bus to a crawl, assuming the vehicle had broken down. He was a helpful man. He intended to see if the driver needed a hand. But as the bus came to a halt, the doors of the van slid open. 3 men emerged. They were wearing nylon stockings over their faces, distorting their features into eerie, faceless masks. More terrifyingly, they were carrying sawed-off shotguns. Before Ed could even process the sight, one of the men was at his side window, leveling a barrel at his head. Another scrambled through the bus doors. The transition from a mundane afternoon to a nightmare was instantaneous. The children, who had been laughing seconds before, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. One of the gunmen took the driver's seat, forcing Ed into the back with the children. The white van trailed behind as the bus was driven into a dry creek bed, hidden from the main road by thick brush. Waiting, there was a second van. The kidnappers didn't speak much. They moved with a clinical, hurried efficiency. They ordered Ed and the 26 children out of the bus and into the 2 vans. The windows of these vans had been painted over from the inside, and the rear doors were reinforced with plywood. It was pitch black. As the vans pulled away, the children began to cry. The youngest were terrified, while the older ones tried to whisper words of comfort. They didn't quite believe themselves. Ed Ray sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He counted the children over and over, trying to ensure they were all there, trying to keep his own rising panic from infecting the group. They drove for nearly 12 hours. The heat inside the unventilated vans became stifling, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. They had no food, no water, and no idea where they were going. When the vans finally stopped, the doors opened to the cool night air of a completely different landscape. They were at a rock quarry in Livermore, over 100 miles away from Chowchilla. One by one, the kidnappers took them out, but they weren't being released. In the middle of the quarry floor, there was a hole. A ladder led down into the earth. The kidnappers forced Ed and the children down that ladder. At the bottom, They found themselves inside the hollowed-out shell of an old moving truck that had been buried underground. The kidnappers handed down a few rolls of toilet paper, some jugs of water, and a few boxes of cereal. Then, they pulled up the ladder. They laid heavy steel plates over the opening and weighted them down with massive industrial batteries. Finally, Ed and the children heard the sound of dirt being shoveled over the top. They were being buried alive. Inside the buried van, the conditions were grim. The ceiling began to sag under the weight of the dirt above. There were two large exhaust pipes intended to provide ventilation, but in the stagnant air of the underground, it felt like they were breathing through straws. The youngest children were hysterical, convinced they were in a tomb. Ed Ray was a quiet man, but in that hole, he became the anchor. He and the oldest boy, 14-year-old Michael Marshall, realized very quickly that they couldn't just wait to be found. They had no reason to believe anyone knew where they were. If they stayed, the roof would eventually cave in or the oxygen would run out. Michael Marshall later recalled that he felt a sudden, fierce surge of clarity. He told the others that he wasn't going to die down there. He and Ed began to stack the mattresses that had been left in the van, creating a makeshift platform underneath the manhole cover. For hours, Ed and Michael took turns pushing against the steel plates. It felt impossible. The plates were weighed down by hundreds of pounds of hardware and dirt. Every time they pushed, a little bit of dust would shake loose from the ceiling, a reminder of the mountain of earth pressing down on them. Their muscles burned, and their lungs ached in the thinning air. After what felt like an eternity, they felt a slight movement. When the plates shifted, this gave them a second wind. They pushed with everything they had left, wedging a piece of wood into the gap to keep the plate from sliding back. Slowly, painfully, they managed to move the batteries aside. Michael squeezed through the opening and began to dig through the fresh soil with his bare hands. When he finally broke the surface, he didn't see guards or gunmen. He saw the stars. He pulled himself out and then helped Ed Ray bring the 26 children up one by one. They had been underground for 16 hours. They wandered through the quarry until they found a worker who was understandably shocked to see a line of dust-covered children emerging from the earth like ghosts. Back in Chowchilla, the town had been paralyzed. When the bus hadn't returned, a massive search had been launched. Families gathered at the local fire station, waiting for news that didn't come. When the call finally arrived that the children had been found safe in Livermore, the relief was so profound it was described as a physical wave hitting the town. But while the victims were safe, the question remained: who would do this, and why? The quarry belonged to the son of the quarry owner, a man named Frederick Newhall Woods. He and two of his friends, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld, quickly became the primary suspects. These weren't hardened criminals from the underworld. They were young men from wealthy, privileged backgrounds in the San Francisco Bay Area. Investigators found a draft of a ransom note demanding $5 million. The kidnappers had planned to call the authorities to state their demands, but the phone lines in Chowchilla were so jammed with media and panicked parents that they couldn't get through. They decided to take a nap, intending to try again later. By the time they woke up, their victims had already escaped. The Chowchilla Three went on the run, but were captured within weeks. During the trial, a bizarre and chilling motive emerged. They hadn't committed the crime out of desperation. They were bored. They wanted to pull off the perfect crime to fund a lifestyle of even greater luxury. They had spent months preparing the site, burying the van, and rehearsing the abduction. All three were sentenced to life in prison. Over the decades, the case has become a study in the resilience of the human spirit. The image of Ed Ray and Michael Marshall refusing to accept their fate remains one of the most powerful stories in California history. The physical scars of the event healed, but for the 26 children, the emotional weight of that July afternoon followed them into adulthood. Many suffered from nightmares and claustrophobia for the rest of their lives. Ed Ray was hailed as a hero, though he remained a humble man, returning to his bus route and driving the children of Chowchilla for many more years, always keeping a watchful eye on the road ahead. Next story: the murder of Janet Smith. Vancouver, British Columbia, 1924. The Shaughnessy district of Vancouver in the early 1920s was an enclave of the impossible. It was a neighborhood of winding crescents and towering granite walls, where the British Empire's colonial elite built Tudor mansions to shield themselves from the gritty reality of a growing port city. Behind these manicured hedges, life followed a rigid, predictable rhythm of afternoon teas, evening galas, and the silent, invisible labor of a domestic underclass. But on the afternoon of July 26, 1924, that rhythm was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a gentleman's home. The sharp, sudden crack of a .45 caliber revolver. The sound came from the basement of the mansion at 3851 Osler Avenue, the home of F.L. Baker, a wealthy drug importer. When the house searched, they found 22-year-old Janet Smith, the family's Scottish nursemaid, lying on the cool linoleum floor of the laundry room. She was dead. A bullet had entered her temple, and a heavy service revolver lay near her hand. To the authorities who first arrived on the scene, the narrative seemed tragically simple. A young woman, perhaps homesick or overwhelmed by the pressures of her station, had taken her own life. The Point Grey Police, a small local force accustomed to noise complaints rather than homicides, closed the case within hours. They didn't bother with an autopsy. They didn't check for gunpowder residue on her hands. They didn't even account for the fact that the bullet's trajectory seemed physically impossible for a self-inflicted wound. They simply called it suicide and expected the city to move on. But Vancouver would not move on, because Janet Smith wasn't just a nursemaid. She was a bread-and-butter girl, a young, white immigrant from the United Kingdom. Her death became the spark that ignited a powder keg of racial tension, class warfare, and political corruption that would nearly tear the province apart. The suspicion began with the people who knew Janet. She was vibrant, popular, and by all accounts, planning her future. There was no note. More importantly, there was the houseboy. In the racial hierarchy of 1920s British Columbia, Wong Foon Sing, the Baker family's Chinese cook, was a figure of immediate suspicion. To the white elite of Shaughnessy, he was a fixture of the household. To the burgeoning White Canada movement, he was a convenient villain. As rumors swirled that the police were covering up a murder to protect the reputation of the wealthy Baker family, the public outcry reached a fever pitch. The United Free Church of Scotland and various women's groups demanded the case be reopened. They didn't believe a refined girl like Janet would use a bulky military sidearm to end her life. They whispered that something darker had happened in that basement, something the police were paid to ignore. Under immense pressure, the body of Janet Smith was exhumed. This time, the examination told a different story. The pathologist found no singeing on the skin, which almost always accompanies a contact shot in a suicide. Even more chilling were the bruises, dark marks on her arms, and a fracture to her hyoid bone, suggesting she had been restrained or strangled before the gun was even fired. The suicide was a fabrication. Janet Smith had been murdered. The investigation that followed was less a search for truth and more a descent into madness. The primary target was Wong Foon Sing. The theory presented by the press and the prosecution was that Wong had made advances toward Janet, was rejected, and killed her in a fit of rage. Despite a total lack of physical evidence linking him to the trigger, the atmosphere in Vancouver was so thick with anti-Asian sentiment that his guilt was treated as a foregone conclusion. However, the Baker family stood by their cook, which only fueled the fire. Proponents of the elite cover-up theory argued that the Bakers were protecting Wong because he knew too much about the wild parties and drug smuggling allegedly occurring at the Osler Avenue mansion. It was rumored that Janet had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see, perhaps a shipment of opium, or perhaps the predatory behavior of a high society guest. What happened next remains one of the most bizarre chapters in Canadian legal history. In March 1925, a group of men dressed in Ku Klux Klan robes, a group that had gained a terrifying foothold in Vancouver at the time, kidnapped Wong Foon Sing from the Baker residence. They spirited him away to a house in the Fairview district, where they tortured him for 6 weeks. They beat him, hung him by his feet, and demanded he confess to the murder. Through the agony, Wong maintained his innocence. When his captors finally realized they couldn't break him, they simply dumped him on a roadside. The kidnapping, rather than leading to a confession, turned the tide of the investigation into a farce. When Wong was eventually put on trial for Janet's murder, the case collapsed. There was no evidence, the confessions were non-existent, and the star witnesses for the prosecution were found to be unreliable. Wong Foon Sing was acquitted and eventually returned to China, his life ruined by a crime he likely didn't commit. But if it wasn't the cook, then who was it? As the years passed, the shadow of Shaughnessy grew longer. Investigative journalists and amateur sleuths began to look at the other inhabitants of the house and their social circle. One name that frequently surfaced was Jack Robinson, a frequent guest at the Baker home and a man with a reputation for being difficult with women. Others looked toward F.L. Baker himself, suggesting a domestic dispute turned fatal. There was also the matter of the weapon. The .45 caliber revolver was a massive gun, a military-grade weapon that would have been difficult for Janet to handle, let alone fire into her own temple with the precision required to kill her instantly without leaving a burn mark. That gun belonged to the house, to the men of the house. The Janet Smith case changed British Columbia forever. It led to the Janet Smith Bill, which sought to ban Asian men from working in households with white women, a reactionary piece of legislation that highlighted the era's deep-seated xenophobia. It also led to the professionalization of the Vancouver Police Department, as the incompetence shown by the Point Grey Force became a national embarrassment. Today, the mansion on Osler Avenue still stands, a silent monument to a summer afternoon in 1924. The laundry room where Janet was found has been renovated many times over, the bloodstains long gone. The echoes of the gunshot faded into the quiet hum of a wealthy neighborhood. Janet Smith was buried in an unmarked grave for years. A girl who came to the New World seeking a better life and found only the sharp end of a conspiracy she couldn't have understood. The file remains open, technically unsolved, though the streets of Vancouver still whisper the names of the powerful men who walked away while a nursemaid and a cook paid the price for their secrets. Next story, the murder of William Desmond Taylor. Los Angeles, California, 1922. The morning of February 2nd, 1922, began like any other in the affluent Alvarado Court Apartments of Los Angeles. The neighborhood was a quiet enclave for the elite of the burgeoning motion picture industry, a place where the stars could retreat from the glare of the studio lights. At around 7:30 a.m., Henry Peavy, a houseman, arrived at the bungalow of his employer, William Desmond Taylor. Peavy expected to find Taylor at his desk, or perhaps still asleep. Instead, he found the front door unlocked. Upon entering the living room, he discovered Taylor sprawled face down on the floor. At first, Peavy thought his employer had suffered a sudden, tragic medical emergency. He ran into the street, shouting for help. A crowd quickly gathered, including several high-ranking officials from Paramount Pictures who seemed to arrive with suspicious speed. A doctor from the neighborhood was the first to examine the body. In a bizarre turn of events that would set the tone for the entire investigation, the doctor pronounced Taylor dead of a stomach hemorrhage. This diagnosis was accepted without question for several minutes, until the coroner arrived and rolled the body over. Beneath William Desmond Taylor lay a pool of blood, and in his back was a single clean bullet hole from a .38 caliber pistol. The stomach hemorrhage was a fabrication, perhaps an early attempt by studio fixers to avoid a scandal. But as the truth of the murder came to light, it ignited a firestorm that would consume Hollywood, exposing the rot beneath the glitz of the silent film era. William Desmond Taylor was no ordinary victim. He was one of the most powerful directors in the world, the president of the Motion Picture Directors Association, and a man known for his impeccable character and sophistication. He was the moral compass of an industry that was already gaining a reputation for debauchery. Yet, as the Los Angeles Police Department began to peel back the layers of his life, they found that the moral compass was living in a world of shadows, surrounded by people who had every reason to want him dead. The investigation immediately turned to the events of the previous night. Taylor had spent the evening of February 1st with Mabel Normand, one of the most famous comedic actresses of the day. Normand was the golden girl of the screen, but her private life was spiraling out of control due to a severe addiction to cocaine. Taylor, who was deeply fond of her, had been acting as a mentor, trying to pull her away from the drug dealers who were draining her bank account. On the night he died, Mabel had stopped by to pick up a book. They shared a few laughs. Taylor walked her to her car at 7:45 p.m., blew her a kiss, and returned to his bungalow. He was never seen alive again. When the police searched the crime scene, they found Mabel's letters, but they also found something far more scandalous. A collection of lacy lingerie and love letters from another starlet, Mary Miles Minter. Minter was the sweetheart of the screen, a teenager with a pristine, virginal image carefully curated by her overbearing mother, Charlotte Shelby. The discovery of Minter's monogrammed nightgown in Taylor's closet sent shockwaves through the studio. If the public learned that the 40-something director was involved with a teenage girl, both their careers and millions in studio profits would vanish. The investigators soon realized that Taylor's past was as much of a mystery as his death. William Desmond Taylor didn't exist before 1908. He was actually William Cunningham Dean Tanner, an Irishman who had abandoned a wife and daughter in New York years earlier, vanished without a trace, and reinvented himself in Hollywood. This revelation opened the door to the possibility that someone from his former life had come back to settle score. However, the suspects closer to home were far more compelling. First, there was Edward Sands, Taylor's former valet. Sands was a career criminal who had recently forged Taylor's signature on several checks and burgled his home before disappearing. The police speculated that Sands might have returned to finish the job or to blackmail his former employer. But Sands was never found, remaining a ghost in the annals of the case. Then there was the stage mother from hell, Charlotte Shelby. Shelby was known for her ruthless control over Mary Miles Minter's life and finances. She viewed Taylor as a threat to her daughter's career and, more importantly, to her own control over Mary's fortune. Rumors swirled that Shelby owned a rare .38 caliber pistol with unusual ammunition, the same type used to kill Taylor. Witnesses claimed to have seen a figure leaving Taylor's bungalow that night who matched Shelby's stature, perhaps disguised in men's clothing. Furthermore, it was whispered that Shelby had bribed the district attorney to keep her name out of the official grand jury proceedings. The crime scene itself was a disaster for forensics. Before the police could properly secure the area, Paramount executives and fixers had reportedly swarmed the bungalow. They were seen burning papers in the fireplace and whisking away crates of evidence. By the time the LAPD had full control, the most incriminating evidence regarding the studio's stars had likely been destroyed. The industry was in survival mode. They couldn't afford another scandal after the recent Arbuckle trial. As days turned into weeks, the media circus reached a fever pitch. The newspapers, led by the Hearst Empire, printed increasingly sensational stories. They painted Taylor as a drug kingpin, a secret bohemian, and a predator. The public's fascination with the sinful lifestyle of Hollywood stars began to turn into genuine outrage. The Taylor murder, combined with the Roscoe, Fatty, Arbuckle rape trial, and the overdose of Wallace Reed, forced the film industry to implement the Hays Code, a strict set of moral guidelines that would govern cinema for decades. In the middle of this chaos were the women whose lives were being dismantled by the investigation. Mabel Normand's career never recovered from the association with the murder and her drug use. She died of tuberculosis just a few years later, her reputation in tatters. Mary Miles Minter's career ended almost overnight. The discovery of her obsession with Taylor and her mother's potential involvement made her box office poison. She spent the rest of her life as a recluse, forever haunted by the events of that February morning. Despite the numerous leads and high-profile suspects, no one was ever charged with the murder of William Desmond Taylor. The case file remains open, a century-old cold case that serves as the ultimate whodunit of the silent era. Was it the disgruntled valet, Edward Sands, seeking revenge? Was it a drug dealer sent to silence Taylor for interfering with Mabel Normand's supply? Or was it Charlotte Shelby, the protective mother who took the law into her own hands to save her daughter's image? Decades later, Director King Vidor attempted to solve the case privately. His research pointed heavily toward Charlotte Shelby, suggesting a cover-up that reached the highest levels of city government. He claimed to have found evidence that the murder weapon had been tossed into a nearby lake, but by then, the witnesses were dead and the trail was cold. The murder of William Desmond Taylor was more than just a homicide. It was the end of Hollywood's age of innocence. It proved that the silver screen was a facade, a thin veil covering a world of secrets, reinvention, and desperation. Taylor's body was buried in a grand mausoleum, but his secrets and the identity of his killer stayed locked behind the marble. To this day, if you walk through the streets of what was once the Alvarado Court, the bungalows are gone, replaced by modern developments. But the ghost of the man with two names and a single bullet in his back still lingers over Hollywood, a reminder that in the city of dreams, the most compelling stories are often the ones the cameras never captured. Next story, the Gainesville Ripper. Gainesville, Florida, 1990. The late summer heat in northern Florida is usually the primary concern for incoming students at the University of Florida. In August of 1990, thousands of young adults were descending upon Gainesville, hauling boxes into dorms and off-campus apartments, fueled by the nervous energy of a new semester. But as the sun set on August 24th, that energy shifted from excitement to a primal, suffocating fear. What was supposed to be a week of orientation and social discovery became a nightmare that would leave an indelible mark on the town and change the way American universities approached campus safety forever. The horror began at the Williamsburg Village Apartments. Sonia Larson and Christina Powell were two freshmen looking forward to their first year of college life. When they didn't show up for classes and failed to answer calls from concerned family members, a maintenance worker was sent to check on their unit. He entered a scene so grisly, so meticulously orchestrated, that it defied the typical logic of a crime of passion. The scene wasn't just a murder, it was a display. One victim was found on the sofa, the other in her bedroom. Both had been subjected to extreme physical trauma and posed in a way that suggested the killer wanted to shock anyone who walked through the door. As investigators processed the apartment, the realization dawned on them that this wasn't an isolated incident of domestic violence. There was no sign of forced entry through the door, though a sliding glass window appeared to be the point of access. The precision of the wounds suggested a perpetrator who was comfortable with a blade and entirely devoid of empathy. While the police were still trying to wrap their heads around the Williamsburg crime scene, the killer was already moving. Only 48 hours later, just blocks away at the Gatorwood Apartments, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt failed to show up for her shift at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, where she worked as a clerk. When a deputy went to check on her, they found a scene that was arguably more depraved than the first. The killer had not only taken her life, but had engaged in a ritualistic decapitation, placing her head on a shelf so it would be the first thing the authorities saw upon entering the room. The news hit Gainesville like a physical blow. Panic didn't just set in, it paralyzed the city. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a targeted hit. There was a predator in the shadows, someone who was hunting students in the very places they felt most secure. The University of Florida, usually a place of vibrant activity, became a ghost town overnight. Students began sleeping in groups, barricading their doors with furniture, and arming themselves with whatever they could find. Many simply packed their bags and fled, leaving behind half-unpacked dorm rooms. The pressure on law enforcement was astronomical. A multi-agency task force was formed, bringing together local police, the FBI, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They were looking for a ghost. There were no witnesses, no obvious fingerprints, and no clear motive other than the gratification of the killer's dark impulses. On August 28th, the killer struck again. This time, the location was an off-campus apartment shared by Tracy Poles and Manny Tabawada. Manny was a standout athlete, and Tracy was an aspiring lawyer. Unlike the previous victims, Manny was a large, strong man. The evidence at the scene suggested he had fought back, but he had been caught off guard in his sleep. After killing Manny, the intruder turned his attention to Tracy. The pattern remained consistent. The use of a sharp combat knife, the lack of forced entry through the main doors, and the chilling post-mortem posing of the bodies. With 5 victims in less than a week, the Gainesville Ripper became a national headline. The FBI's behavioral science unit began constructing a profile. They were looking for a white male, likely in his 20s or 30s, who had a background in the military or law enforcement due to the precision of the attacks. They believed he was someone who felt a profound sense of inadequacy and used these horrific acts to exert a sense of ultimate power. While the task force followed thousands of leads, they initially focused on a local student named Edward Humphrey. He was a young man with a history of mental health struggles and a volatile personality. He lived in the same apartment complex as some of the victims and had a facial injury that seemed suspicious. For months, the public and the media were convinced Humphrey was the Ripper. He was arrested on unrelated charges and kept in the spotlight, but the physical evidence, specifically the DNA recovered from the crime scenes, didn't match. The real break in the case didn't come from a brilliant deduction or a witness tip. It came from a series of seemingly unrelated crimes in Ocala, Florida, about 40 miles south of Gainesville. Weeks before the murders, a man had robbed a grocery store in Ocala. During the getaway, he had abandoned a campsite in the woods. When investigators searched the campsite, they found a bag containing a screwdriver, a change of clothes, and a money bag from the robbed store. More importantly, they found a cassette tape. When they played it, they heard a man singing mournful songs and talking about his inner demons. The man associated with that campsite was Danny Rolling. Rolling was a drifter from Shreveport, Louisiana, with a long history of violent behavior. He had been raised in an extremely abusive household, the son of a police officer who reportedly tormented him throughout his childhood. Danny had cycled in and out of prison for years. Just months before arriving in Florida, he had allegedly attempted to murder his father, shooting him in the face during an argument. When Rolling was finally captured following a separate grocery store robbery, he was initially just a suspect for the Ocala crimes. However, a savvy investigator noticed the similarities between the tools Rolling used for his burglaries and the methods used by the Gainesville Ripper. The DNA profile was the final nail in the coffin. The genetic material left at the Gainesville crime scenes was an undeniable match to Danny Rolling. As the investigation delved deeper into Rolling's past, an even darker picture emerged. Authorities in Shreveport began looking at an unsolved triple homicide from 1989. In that case, 55-year-old William Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean had been brutally murdered in their home. The staging of Julie Grissom's body bore a terrifying resemblance to the scenes in Gainesville. Rolling would eventually confess to those murders as well, revealing a timeline of violence that spanned states. The trial of Danny Rolling was a media circus, but it took an unexpected turn. In 1994, just as the proceedings were beginning, Rolling pleaded guilty to all 5 Gainesville murders. There would be no long, drawn-out trial to determine guilt. The focus shifted entirely to the penalty phase. The defense attempted to paint Rolling as a victim of his upbringing, a man shattered by the physical and emotional abuse of his father. They argued that he suffered from multiple personality disorder and that a shadow person, named Gemini, was responsible for the killings. They brought in psychologists and family members to testify to the cycle of violence that had birthed a monster. However, the prosecution presented a different narrative. They showed the jury the evidence of Rolling's premeditation. He hadn't just snapped, he had stalked. He had prepared his kill kit with surgical precision. He had watched his victims, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't just kill, he enjoyed the aftermath, taking the time to pose the victims in ways designed to maximize the trauma of those who found them. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom, forced to hear the harrowing details of their loved ones' final moments. The dignity they showed in the face of such senseless cruelty was a stark contrast to Rolling's behavior. Throughout the proceedings, Rolling remained an enigma, sometimes appearing remorseful, other times chillingly detached, even breaking into song at one point during his testimony. The jury was not swayed by the pleas for mercy. They saw the Gainesville Ripper for what he was, a calculated predator who had shattered the innocence of a community for his own gratification. In 1994, Danny Rolling was sentenced to death. Rolling spent over a decade on death row, exhausting his appeals. During this time, he became a subject of fascination for criminologists and true crime enthusiasts. He even cooperated with a writer to produce a book about his life, though many saw it as a final attempt to control the narrative of his own crimes. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He spent his final moments singing a hymn he had written, a final bizarre display from a man who had caused so much silence. The legacy of the Gainesville Ripper lives on, not just in the trauma of the survivors and their families, but in the physical landscape of college campuses. The 1990 murders led to a massive overhaul of campus security measures across the United States. Better lighting, more robust emergency communication systems, and increased police presence became the new standard. The tragedy served as a brutal wake-up call that the ivory tower was not immune to the darkness of the world outside. In Gainesville, a memorial stands to honor the 5 lives lost during that terrible week in August. Sonia, Christina, Krista, Tracy, and Manny. They are remembered not for the way they died, but for the people they were, students with dreams, friends with bright futures, and members of a community that refused to be defined solely by the monster who passed through it. Next story, the murder of James Bulger. Kirkby, England, 1993. The Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, Merseyside, was a typical hub of Friday afternoon activity on February 12, 1993. It was a place of mundane errands and school holiday crowds. Among the shoppers was Denise Bulger, a young mother accompanied by her 2-year-old son, James. He was a lively toddler, full of the curiosity that defines that age, dressed in a blue quilted jacket and matching corduroy trousers. As Denise stepped into a local butcher shop, she momentarily released James's hand to reach for a purse. It was a lapse of mere seconds, the kind of fleeting distraction every parent has experienced. But when she looked down, the space beside her was empty. James was gone. The panic that sets in during such a moment is visceral. Denise searched the immediate area, her voice rising as she called his name, but the boy with the bright eyes and the easy smile had vanished into the swell of the crowd. Security was alerted, and the mall's grainy closed-circuit television cameras were reviewed. What the footage revealed would soon become one of the most haunting images in the history of British crime. The black and white tape showed James being led away by 2 older boys. They didn't look like predators in the traditional sense. They were children themselves. They were seen holding James's hand, guiding him toward the exit. To any casual observer, they might have looked like older brothers or cousins helping a toddler find his way. But as they walked out of the mall and into the biting February air, a timeline began that would lead to a conclusion so dark it challenged the public's fundamental understanding of childhood innocence. The 2 boys leading James away were 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson. They had skipped school that day, wandering the shopping center with a vague and disturbing intent. Before they encountered James, they had been spotted playing near the escalators and even attempting to lure away another child, whose mother had remained vigilant. James, unfortunately, had been the one they finally reached. As evening began to fall over Merseyside, the 3 children embarked on a wandering, circuitous journey that spanned over 2 miles. They weren't hiding. They walked through busy streets, across pedestrian bridges, and past dozens of witnesses. James was visibly distressed. He had a bump on his forehead, he was crying, and he was struggling to keep up with the older boy's pace. At several points, people stopped to ask if the toddler was all right. Venables and Thompson had ready-made lies. They told passers-by that James was their younger brother, or that they were taking a lost child to the police station. One witness saw James being kicked. Another saw him being pulled along by his arm. Yet, in a series of tragic near misses, no one intervened long enough to change the course of the day. The social contract of the time, the assumption that children were generally safe in the company of other children, acted as a veil that masked the unfolding horror. The trek eventually led them to a secluded railway embankment near the Walton Lane police station. It was here, in the gathering dusk and away from the eyes of the public, that the situation shifted from a wandering abduction to an act of incomprehensible cruelty. The details of what happened on those tracks are difficult to process. James was subjected to a prolonged and systematic assault. His attackers used bricks, stones, and a heavy iron bar. They applied blue paint to his face and eyes. The level of violence was not the impulsive lashing out of a child, but a sustained period of torture that lasted for a significant amount of time. Finally, the two 10-year-olds laid James across the railway tracks, weighing his body down with rubble in a calculated attempt to make his death look like an accident involving a train. Then, they simply walked away. They went home to their families, ate dinner, and watched television as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, on Sunday afternoon, James's body was discovered by a group of teenagers playing near the tracks. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and the entire country. The police, already investigating a missing person case, now found themselves at the center of a murder inquiry that defied every known profile of the killer. The grainy CCTV footage from the Strand shopping center was released to the media, and it became the focal point of the investigation. The images were broadcast on every news station, showing the boys in the shadows leading James to his death. The public's response was a mixture of grief and a desperate need for justice. Thousands of tips flooded in. People recognized the jackets the boys were wearing. They recognized their gait and their presence in the mall that day. It didn't take long for the investigation to narrow down on Venables and Thompson. Both boys had been truant from school on the day of the disappearance. When police arrived at their homes, the evidence was overwhelming. Clothes stained with blue paint and blood were recovered. Forensic analysis linked the materials found at the railway embankment directly to the suspects. The interrogation of the two boys provided a chilling look into their mindsets. Initially, they lied, blaming each other or inventing imaginary older boys who had forced them to act. But under the pressure of the evidence, the stories began to crumble. Venables was often described as the more outwardly emotional of the two, prone to outbursts of tears, while Thompson remained remarkably detached and stoic, often appearing to lead the narrative during their questioning. The trial, which began in November 1993 at Press and Crown Court, was a media circus and a legal landmark. The sight of two 10-year-old boys sitting in a dock, needing raised platforms just to see over the wood, was surreal. The prosecution argued that while they were children, they were doli capax, legally capable of understanding that their actions were seriously wrong. The evidence of their premeditation, their lies to witnesses on the street, and their efforts to conceal the body suggested a level of awareness that far exceeded their years. The defense tried to paint a picture of troubled upbringings and a lack of moral guidance, but the sheer brutality of the crime made sympathy hard to come by. Outside the courthouse, angry crowds gathered, some even attacking the vans transporting the boys. The national mood was one of pure outrage. The idea that children could harbor such darkness was a concept that society was not prepared to accept. The jury found both Venables and Thompson guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger. They were sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with a recommended minimum term that would eventually be set at 8 years. The judge described their actions as an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. The aftermath of the trial did not bring the closure many had hoped for. Instead, it sparked decades of debate regarding the age of criminal responsibility and the potential for rehabilitation. While in secure children's homes, both boys received intensive therapy and education. In 2001, at the age of 18, they were released under new identities with lifelong anonymity orders to protect them from vigilante justice. The release was met with further public outcry. For Denise and the Bulger family, the idea that the killers of their son could walk free and start over under the protection of the state was an unbearable second trauma. Denise became a prominent campaigner for victims' rights, fighting to ensure that James was never forgotten and that the justice system accounted for the gravity of such crimes. Over the years, the case has remained in the headlines, particularly concerning John Venables. Unlike Thompson, who vanished into his new life and has not been heard from since. Venables struggled to stay within the law. He was returned to prison multiple times for possessing prohibited materials, leading many to question whether he was ever truly rehabilitated or if the darkness that manifested on those railway tracks was something that could never be erased. Next story, the Lord High Executioner. New York City, 1957. The Park Sheraton Hotel on 56th Street and 7th Avenue was a place of high-gloss marble, thick carpets, and the kind of hushed luxury that only old New York could provide. It was a mid-morning in October, the air crisp with the turning season, and the city's elite were moving through the lobby with the practiced indifference of the wealthy. But tucked away on the lower level, in the hotel's barber shop, a different kind of power was settling into chair number 4. The man in the chair was not a titan of industry or a Hollywood star, though he carried himself with more authority than both combined. He was 55 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and a reputation that made even the toughest men in the 5 boroughs lower their voices. He was Albert Anastasia. To the newspapers, he was the Mad Hatter. To the underworld, he was the Lord High Executioner. And for the next 20 minutes, he just wanted a haircut and a shave. He leaned back, the white barber's cloth draped over his broad shoulders. He closed his eyes, perhaps finally relaxing in a life defined by constant, vibrating tension. Behind him, the shop was quiet. His bodyguard, a man who was supposed to be a shadow, had curiously decided to take a walk around the block. In the world of the syndicate, coincidences like that were usually a death sentence. The door to the barber shop creaked open. 2 men walked in. They weren't there for a trim. They wore scarves muffled around their faces and dark glasses, moving with a synchronized, chilling purpose. They didn't say a word. They didn't demand money. They simply walked up to chair number 4, pulled out .38 and .32 caliber revolvers, and opened fire. What happened next was a scene of pure, cinematic chaos. The first shots shattered the morning silence, echoing off the tiled walls and mirrors. Anastasia, a man who had survived decades of gang wars and sent countless rivals to their graves, didn't go out quietly. In a moment of sheer, panicked instinct, he lunged forward, but his eyes were still closed, or perhaps clouded by the sudden shock. Instead of attacking his gunman, he threw himself at the reflection of the killers in the wall-to-wall mirror. He tackled the glass, shattering his own image as more bullets tore into his back and head. He collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by broken glass, white shaving cream, and the scent of gunpowder. The Lord High Executioner was dead. To understand why Albert Anastasia had to die in such a public, violent fashion, you have to look back at the machine he helped build. Anastasia wasn't just a mobster. He was a founding father of the modern American mafia. Born Umberto Anastasio in Calabria, Italy, he arrived in New York as a teenager and quickly realized that the American dream looked a lot different from the back of a Brooklyn pier. He rose through the ranks of the longshoremen's unions, not through charisma, but through a terrifying capacity for violence. By the 1930s, he had become the primary enforcer for the Commission, the board of directors for the National Crime Syndicate. He was the head of the enforcement arm that the press famously dubbed Murder Incorporated. This wasn't a gang. It was a corporate department dedicated to one thing: permanent solutions to internal problems. Under Anastasia's leadership, Murder Incorporated was estimated to be responsible for hundreds of deaths across the country. They were the men who used ice picks and garrotes, operating with a cold, professional detachment. Anastasia was the man who gave the orders. He was a man who believed that power was something you took and held with an iron fist. But in the world of the Cosa Nostra, the only thing more dangerous than being weak is being too strong. By the mid-1950s, the landscape of the New York underworld was shifting. The old guard was being challenged by a younger, more ambitious generation. Specifically, a man named Vito Genovese. Genovese was a tactician, a man who played the long game, and he saw Anastasia as a relic, a volatile, violent madman who was drawing too much heat from the feds and taking up too much space at the top of the food chain. Anastasia had also broken the golden rule of the mafia. He had started selling memberships. He was reportedly taking money to make new members without the approval of the other families, effectively diluting the honored society for a quick buck. To men like Genovese and Carlo Gambino, this wasn't just greed. It was an insult to the foundation of their power. The tension had been simmering for years. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld and a close ally of Anastasia, had narrowly survived an assassination attempt earlier in 1957. Genovese was making his move, systematically stripping away Anastasia's support system. By October, Anastasia was an island. He was a king without an army, though he seemed too arrogant to realize it. He walked into that barber shop thinking he was untouchable, forgetting that in his business, the moment you stop looking over your shoulder is the moment you stop breathing. The aftermath of the shooting was a frenzy. The gunmen vanished into the New York crowds, dropping their weapons as they fled. The police arrived to find a scene that looked like a macabre art installation. Anastasia lay face down, his blood staining the pristine white tiles. The barbers were shaking, claiming they saw nothing, knew nothing. It was the omerta in its purest form, the code of silence that kept the gears of the syndicate turning. The investigation was, as many expected, a series of dead ends. Despite the high-profile nature of the victim and the brazenness of the hit, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for the murder of Albert Anastasia. The theories, however, were endless. For years, it was rumored that the hit was carried out by a crew from the Gallo brothers, a rebellious faction within the Prophesy family. Others pointed directly to the Mad Hatter's own underboss, Carlo Gambino. If you look at who benefited most from the vacancy at the head of the Anastasia family, the answer becomes clear. Shortly after the funeral, the family was renamed. It became the Gambino crime family, which would go on to become the most powerful criminal organization in the United States for decades. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, unassuming man who sat at Anastasia's right hand, had effectively inherited an empire. The hit at the Park Sheridan wasn't just a murder, it was a message. It signaled the end of the Murder Incorporated era and the beginning of a more corporate, shadow-dwelling mafia. It showed that no matter how many men you had killed, or how much fear you had instilled, you were never bigger than the commission. Today, if you visit the site of the old Park Sheridan, now the Park Central Hotel, there is no plaque to mark the spot where the Lord High Executioner met his end. The barber shop is long gone, replaced by modern amenities for tourists who have no idea they are walking over the ghosts of the city's darkest era. But for true crime historians, the image of chair number 4 remains the ultimate symbol of the mafia's golden age. A reminder that in the world of organized crime, the shave is never just a shave, and the person in the mirror isn't always the one you should be watching. The murder of Albert Anastasia remains one of the most famous unsolved hits in history. Next story, the Holly Harvey Crippen case. North London, 1910. The morning fog often clung to the brickwork of Hilldrop Crescent, a quiet, respectable street in Camden Road. It was the sort of neighborhood where neighbors noticed a missing lace curtain or a milk bottle left too long on a doorstep. But in early 1910, the residents of number 39 were more concerned with the absence of the lady of the house. Cora Crippen, known to the musical halls of London by her stage name, Belle Elmore, had vanished. Her husband, Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen, was a small, unassuming man with protruding eyes and a thick mustache that seemed too large for his face. He was an American homeopath, a man who sold patent medicines and quieted his own presence in every room he entered. He told friends that Cora had returned to the United States to visit a sick relative. Later, he told them she had died of pneumonia in California. It was a tragic, if somewhat tidy, end for a woman known for her loud personality and vibrant social life. But Cora's friends in the Music Hall Ladies Guild weren't buying the doctor's quiet grief. Cora loved her jewelry, her furs, and her status. It was unthinkable that she would leave for America without her trunks, or, more importantly, die in a distant land without a single one of them being notified by anyone other than her husband. Their suspicion turned to outrage when they saw the doctor's young typist, Ethel Luneve, appearing at a charity ball wearing Cora's favorite diamond brooch. By July, the pressure from Cora's social circle forced Scotland Yard to take a casual look. Inspector Walter Dew, a veteran detective who would later be immortalized by this single case, visited the Crippen household. The doctor was remarkably calm. He admitted he had lied about Cora's death, claiming instead that she had actually left him for another man, and he had invented the death to avoid the social embarrassment of being a cuckold. Dew, finding the explanation plausible for the era, was satisfied. He was ready to close the file. Then Dr. Crippen panicked. 2 days after the interview, Dew returned to Hilldrop Crescent for a minor follow-up, only to find the house empty. The doctor and Ethel Leneve had fled. This sudden flight transformed a domestic mystery into a high-stakes manhunt. Dew returned to the house with a team and spent 2 days tearing it apart. They looked under floorboards and behind wallpaper, finding nothing. It wasn't until the third day, while prodding the loose bricks of the coal cellar floor, that Dew felt something give way. Underneath the damp clay of the cellar floor, they didn't find a body. They found remains. There was no head, no limbs, and no skeletal structure, just a mass of flesh and viscera buried in quicklime. The lime, intended to consume the evidence, had instead reacted with the moisture in the soil to preserve it. While the grisly discovery dominated London headlines, Crippen and Ethel were already across the English Channel. They had boarded the SS Montrose in Antwerp, bound for Canada. To the rest of the passengers, they were Mr. John Robinson and his teenage son. Ethel had cut her hair short and donned boys' clothing, though the disguise was flimsy at best. The trousers were pinned at the waist, and her gait remained decidedly feminine. They might have escaped into the vastness of North America, if not for a revolutionary piece of technology. The SS Montrose was one of the few ships equipped with a Marconi wireless telegraph. The ship's master, Captain Henry George Kendall, was a keen observer of his passengers. He noticed the father and son were unusually affectionate, often holding hands on deck. He had been reading the newspapers before departure and grew suspicious of the quiet man with the bulging eyes. Kendall retreated to his cabin and sent a message that would change the history of criminal investigation. Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Mustache taken off, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as boy. Voice and manner surely a girl. This was the first time the wireless telegraph was used to catch a criminal. As the Montrose steamed slowly across the Atlantic, the world watched a slow-motion pursuit. Inspector Dew boarded a faster ship, the SS Laurentic, from Liverpool. The Laurentic was a greyhound of the seas, and the race was on. The public followed the daily updates via telegram, fascinated by the idea of the law flying across the waves to intercept the fugitives before they reached the safety of the St. Lawrence River. On the morning of July 31st, as the Montrose neared Father Point in Quebec, a man dressed as a pilot boarded the ship. He approached the doctor on deck. "Good morning, Dr. Crippen," the man said. "I am Inspector Dew of Scotland Yard." The doctor went pale. "Thank God it's over," he reportedly whispered. The suspense was too much. The return journey to England was a media circus. Upon their arrival, Crippen and Ethel were separated. The doctor's primary concern throughout the legal proceedings was not his own life, but the reputation and safety of Ethel. He maintained her total innocence, claiming she knew nothing of what had happened to Cora. The trial at the Old Bailey in October 1910 was a landmark in forensic science. The prosecution's case rested on a single piece of evidence found in the cellar, a piece of skin with a scar. Cora Crippen had once undergone an abdominal operation. Bernard Spilsbury, a young pathologist who would go on to become the most famous medical examiner in British history, testified that the skin found in the cellar showed an old surgical scar consistent with Cora's history. Furthermore, the remains contained traces of hyoscine, a powerful sedative. Crippen, a homeopath, had recently purchased 5 grains of the drug from a local chemist, an amount far exceeding any legitimate medicinal use. The defense argued that the remains weren't Cora's at all. They suggested the house had been used by previous tenants, and the flesh could have been there for years. But the presence of a piece of a pajama top found with the remains, which matched a set Crippen owned, proved to be the final nail in his coffin. It took the jury less than 30 minutes to find Holly Harvey Crippen guilty of murder. Ethel Leneve was tried separately as an accessory after the fact and was acquitted, largely due to Crippen's steadfast refusal to implicate her. On the morning of November 23, 1910, Crippen was executed at Pentonville Prison. His final request was that a photo of Ethel and her letters be placed in his coffin and buried with him. The case remains a cornerstone of true crime history, not just for the gruesome nature of the discovery in the cellar, but for the way it signaled the end of an era. The world was shrinking. The wireless telegraph had proven that no matter how far man ran, the invisible threads of technology could reach out and pull him back. Yet, even a century later, whispers of doubt persist. In 2007, DNA researchers at Michigan State University claimed that the tissue samples preserved from the trial were actually from a male, sparking a debate that threatens to upend the closed status of the case. Was the flesh in the cellar really Cora? If not, who was it? And if Crippen didn't kill his wife, why did he flee? Despite the scientific challenges, the image of the mild-mannered doctor and his disguised lover caught by a ghost in the airwaves remains one of the most haunting chapters in the annals of Newgate. Next story, the Rice Patrick case. New York, 1900. The dawn of the 20th century in New York City was a time of staggering ambition and gilded excess. Manhattan was reaching toward the sky with the first true skyscrapers, and the streets were a chaotic symphony of horse-drawn carriages and early automobiles. But on the morning of September 24th, 1900, in a luxurious apartment at the Berkshire on 52nd Street and Madison Avenue, the silence was heavy with the scent of something sweet and clinical. William Marsh Rice, an 84-year-old multimillionaire, lay dead in his bed. To the casual observer, it was the expected end of a long, lonely life. Rice was a widower, a recluse, and a man whose vast fortune, estimated at over $8 million, had made him increasingly paranoid. His death was initially attributed to natural causes, perhaps hastened by a bout of indigestion or the lingering effects of a recent heat wave. But as the sun set over the city that evening, a series of events began to unfold that would reveal one of the most audacious plots in the history of American crime. It was a conspiracy born of greed, involving a forged will, a chemical cocktail, and a lawyer who thought he was smarter than the law. William Marsh Rice was a self-made titan. He had moved to Texas in his youth, building a sprawling empire of land, cotton, and railroads. By the 1890s, he had returned to New York, living a frugal, almost ascetic lifestyle despite his immense wealth. He had no children. His primary passion in his twilight years was the establishment of the Rice Institute, what we know today as Rice University in Houston. He had already set aside a significant portion of his wealth to ensure his legacy would be one of education and philanthropy. However, Rice's quiet life was interrupted by Albert T. Patrick. Patrick was a small-time lawyer with a sharp mind and a moral compass that pointed nowhere. He had entered Rice's orbit through a legal dispute involving the estate of Rice's second wife. What began as an adversarial relationship soon turned into something far more sinister. Patrick realized that the aging millionaire was isolated and vulnerable. He began to ingratiate himself, not with Rice directly, but with Rice's valet, a young man named Charles Jones. Jones was the classic inside man. He was the one who prepared Rice's meals, administered his medicine, and guarded his privacy. Under Patrick's influence, Jones became a mole. The lawyer coached the valet on how to slowly poison Rice's mind against his existing executors and eventually how to prepare for the old man's end. The scheme began with paper and ink. Patrick was a master of forgery. He spent months practicing Rice's signature, obsessing over every tremor and flourish. He produced a new will, one that radically departed from Rice's long-held intentions. In this 1900 will, the vast majority of the Rice fortune was not destined for the Rice Institute, but for Albert T. Patrick himself. To make it seem legitimate, Patrick included smaller bequests to Rice's relatives and friends, a common tactic to discourage them from contesting the document. But a forged will is only valuable if the testator is dead. As the summer of 1900 turned to autumn, Patrick grew impatient. Rice, despite his age, was remarkably resilient. He had recently survived a fire at one of his properties and seemed invigorated by the challenge of rebuilding. For Patrick, the window of opportunity was closing. He needed Rice gone, and he needed it to look like a natural passing. On the night of September 23rd, the plan went into its final, lethal phase. Patrick had provided Jones with a bottle of chloroform. He instructed the valet that when Rice fell into a deep sleep, he was to saturate a sponge, place it in a cone made of a towel, and hold it over the old man's face. The scene in that Madison Avenue apartment must have been harrowing. Jones, a man who had served Rice for years, stood over the sleeping benefactor in the dim light. He followed the instructions. The sweet, heavy vapors of chloroform filled the room. Rice, weakened by age and a restrictive diet Patrick had encouraged Jones to feed him, didn't stand a chance. He never woke up. After the deed was done, Jones followed the next set of instructions. He removed the sponge, aired out the room, and disposed of the evidence. He then called for a doctor, a man Patrick had recommended, who conveniently certified that Rice had died of old age and weak heart. It was a near-perfect crime. If Patrick had simply stayed quiet and allowed the probate process to move slowly, he might have become one of the wealthiest men in America. But greed has a way of making people reckless. The first crack in the facade appeared the very next morning. Patrick, desperate for immediate liquidity, attempted to cash several large checks signed with William Marsh Rice's name. He sent them to various banks across the city. One of those checks, made out for $25,000, was presented at Swenson's bank. The teller, a man named Wallace, looked at the check and frowned. He knew William Marsh Rice. More importantly, he knew Rice's signature. This signature was too perfect, too deliberate. It lacked the slight, characteristic shaky quality of a man in his mid-80s. Furthermore, the check was made out to Albert Patrick, missing the L in Albert. It was a stunningly sloppy mistake for a master forger. Wallace called Rice's apartment to verify the check. When Jones answered the phone, he stammered and gave conflicting reports. Within hours, the police and Rice's longtime legal associates were alerted. When they arrived at the Berkshire, they found the old man's body already being prepared for a quick cremation, another order Patrick had issued to ensure no autopsy could ever be performed. The authorities acted fast. They halted the cremation just in time. An autopsy was performed by the coroner, and while the science of 1900 was not as advanced as today's, the findings were damning. Rice's lungs were congested in a way that suggested the inhalation of a powerful irritant, not a natural heart failure. The investigation then turned to the paper trail. Investigators found that the new will have been witnessed by people who barely knew Rice or who had been paid off by Patrick. The signatures were analyzed by handwriting experts who declared them sophisticated forgeries. But the real breakthrough came from the valet. Charles Jones was not a hardened criminal. Under the pressure of an intense interrogation, he cracked. He told the police everything. He described the secret meetings with Patrick, the practice sessions for the forgery, and the cold, calculated moments when he held the chloroform sponge over Rice's face. In exchange for his testimony, Jones was granted immunity, a decision that remains controversial to this day, as he was the one who physically committed the murder. The trial of Albert T. Patrick became a sensation. It was the crime of the century, before the century had even truly begun. The courtroom was packed every day with New York's elite and curious onlookers. Patrick, ever the arrogant strategist, acted as his own co-counsel. He paced the floor, cross-examined witnesses with vitriol, and maintained his innocence with a chilling calm. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars: the forged documents, the medical evidence of chloroform poisoning, and the devastating testimony of Charles Jones. Patrick countered by claiming that Rice had grown fond of him and had changed his will of his own volition. He argued that the medical evidence was inconclusive and that Jones was a liar trying to save his own skin. Despite his brilliance and his legal maneuvers, the jury didn't buy it. In 1902, Albert Patrick was found guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing. But the story didn't end there. Patrick was a man who refused to lose. He spent the next 4 years filing appeal after appeal, utilizing every technicality in a New York legal code. His case became a lightning rod for debates over the death penalty and the reliability of medical testimony. In a move that shocked the public, Governor Frank Higgins commuted Patrick's sentence to life imprisonment in 1906, citing doubts about the certainty of the chloroform evidence. Patrick spent the next several years in prison, but he never stopped campaigning for his release. He portrayed himself as a victim of a conspiracy by the Rice Institute's trustees. Eventually, his persistence paid off. In 1912, Governor John Dix granted him a full pardon. Albert Patrick walked out of prison a free man, though he was promptly disbarred and lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, eventually moving to Tulsa, Oklahoma. The aftermath of the Rice-Patrick case had a profound impact. Because the plot failed, the Rice Institute was saved. The millions of dollars that Patrick had tried to steal were instead used to build the university that William Marsh Rice had dreamed of. The school opened its doors in 1912, the same year Patrick was released from prison. To this day, a statue of William Marsh Rice sits in the center of the university's academic court. His ashes are interred under the monument. It is a quiet, dignified end for a man whose death was anything but peaceful. In the end, Albert Patrick wanted to be a legend of New York society. Instead, he became a footnote in a cautionary tale about the limits of greed. And William Marsh Rice, the man who lived in the shadows of his own fortune, achieved a kind of immortality he never could have imagined, not through the money he kept, but through the legacy that survived his murder. The next time you see the spire of a great university or read about a complex financial crime, remember the quiet apartment on 52nd Street. Remember the valet with the sponge and the lawyer with the pen. It is a story that proves that while money can buy many things, it cannot always buy a clean getaway. Next story, the A6 murder. Bedfordshire, England, 1961. The stretch of the A6 highway that cuts through the Dead Man's Hill area of Bedfordshire is a lonely place, even today. But in the early 1960s, under the shroud of a damp August night, it was desolate. It was a place where the darkness felt heavy, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. On that night, a young couple, Michael Gregston and Valerie Story, were looking for nothing more than a quiet place to talk. They had no idea that their evening would end in a nightmare that would become one of the most controversial and debated crimes in British legal history. Michael and Valerie were co-workers at the Road Research Laboratory. Michael was 36, a married man with 2 children, and 22-year-old Valerie was his colleague. They were involved in an extramarital affair, a fact that in 1961 carried a heavy social stigma. This secret led them to seek out secluded spots where they wouldn't be recognized. That evening, they were sitting in Michael's Morris Minor near a cornfield in Dorney Reach. Buckinghamshire Point, the windows were likely cracked to let in the summer air as they discussed their future. The peace was shattered by a sudden tapping on the window. A man stood there, brandishing a revolver. He was described as having saucer-like eyes and a frantic, jittery energy. He forced his way into the car, and for the next 5 hours, he held the couple captive in a wandering, aimless journey across the English countryside. Point 2, the gunman didn't seem to have a destination. He was agitated, rambling about being a hunted man, a stick-up artist who was tired of running. He forced Michael to drive, navigating through winding back roads while he sat in the back, the barrel of the gun never far from the back of Michael's head. The tension inside that small car must have been suffocating. Valerie later recounted how they tried to reason with him, offering him money in the car if he would just let them go. But the man was erratic. At one point, he asked for food. At another, he seemed almost apologetic before snapping back into a state of heightened aggression. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, they found themselves at a lay-by on Dead Man's Hill. The gunman ordered Michael to pull over. The air was cold, and the sky was a bruised gray. The gunman told Michael to hand over a bag of things. As Michael moved to reach for it, 2 shots rang out in the confined space. Michael Gregston was killed instantly. Valerie screamed, a sound that echoed across the empty fields, but there was no one to hear her. The gunman then turned his attention to Valerie. He forced her out of the car and committed a series of horrific acts against her. After he was finished, he turned the weapon on her, firing several times into her body. He left her there, paralyzed and bleeding in the dirt, and drove off in the Morris Minor. Valerie's story was a fighter. Despite her catastrophic injuries, she managed to survive the night. She lay in the grass for hours until she was discovered by a passing motorist the following morning. She was paralyzed from the chest down, a condition that would be permanent, but she was alive, and she was the only witness to the face of a killer. The investigation that followed was one of the largest the country had ever seen. The car was found abandoned in London, and a murder weapon was discovered under a seat on a London bus. The police were under immense pressure to find the A6 killer. The public was gripped by the brutality of the crime and the tragic circumstances of the victims. Two names eventually rose to the top of the suspect list: Peter Alphen and James Hanratty. Peter Alphen was a strange, erratic man who had stayed at the Vienna Hotel in London around the time of the murder. He had behaved suspiciously and matched some of the descriptions. However, as the investigation narrowed, the focus shifted heavily toward James Hanratty. Hanratty was a 25-year-old career criminal, a petty thief with a history of car theft and housebreaking. He was not known for violence, but he fit the physical profile: slim build, pale skin, and those haunting, wide eyes. The evidence against Hanratty was largely circumstantial, but compelling to a 1960 jury. Point 3, most notably, two empty cartridge cases found in the hotel room Hanratty had occupied matched the murder weapon. Furthermore, Valerie's story identified him in a police lineup. It's important to note, however, that the lineup process was flawed by modern standards. Valerie had initially picked out another man in a previous lineup, and when she finally pointed to Hanratty, it was after several viewings. Hanratty's defense was built on a series of shifting alibis. He initially claimed he was in Liverpool on the night of the murder, but when he couldn't provide names of people he met, he changed his story point for he then claimed he was in Rhyl, Wales, staying at a boarding house. He provided a very specific detail. He remembered a green bath in the house. While the police found a boarding house in Rhyl with a green bath, the landlady couldn't definitively place him there on the exact night of the crime. Despite the lack of forensic evidence, no fingerprints of his were found in the car or on the gun. The jury found James Hanratty guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death. Throughout his time in the condemned cell, Hanratty maintained his innocence. He wrote letters to his family, pleading with them to clear his name after he was gone. On April 4th, 1962, James Hanratty was hanged at Bedford Jail. He was one of the last people to be executed in the United Kingdom before capital punishment was abolished. But the execution didn't end the story. For decades, the A6 murder remained a cause célèbre. Campaigners, journalists, and Hanratty's own family insisted that a grave miscarriage of justice had occurred. They pointed to Peter Alphen, who made several bizarre, semi-confessions over the years, only to retract them later. They argued that Hanratty, a man who had never used a gun in his life, was an unlikely candidate for such a cold-blooded execution. The green bath alibi became a symbol of the holes in the prosecution's case. The mystery hung over the British legal system for nearly 40 years. It wasn't until the turn of the millennium that technology finally caught up with the case. In the late 1990s, the case was referred to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. DNA testing, a tool unimaginable in 1961, was now available. The Home Office allowed for the exhumation of James Hanratty's body and the testing of evidence preserved from the crime scene. Specifically, a piece of Valerie Story's clothing and the handkerchief the killer had used. The results were a shock to those who had campaigned for Hanratty's innocence for 40 years. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence was a perfect match for James Hanratty. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else were calculated at nearly 1 billion to 1. In 2002, the Court of Appeal officially upheld the conviction, stating that the DNA evidence proved beyond any doubt that Hanratty was the man in the car that night. Point 5. Even with the DNA evidence, some skeptics remained. They suggested the samples could have been contaminated over the decades, or that the evidence had been mishandled. They pointed to the fact that Valerie Story's initial descriptions didn't perfectly match Hanratty and that the motive for the crime remained entirely unknown. Why would a petty thief take a couple on a 5-hour joyride across the country just to end it in a senseless killing? For Valerie Story, who spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair, the conviction provided a closure that the execution never truly could. She passed away in 2016, having lived a life defined by a single night of terror on a dark Bedfordshire road. Point 6. Whether you view Hanratty as a monster who hid behind a mask of innocence or a victim of a system that rushed to judgment, the name Dead Man's Hill remains a permanent scar on the landscape. Forever linked to the night the A6 became a road to nowhere. Next story, the Nightingale Shore Murder. Pevensey Bay, Sussex, 1920. The coastal air of Sussex is often described as bracing, but on the evening of August 19th, 1920, it carried a chill that had nothing to do with the English Channel. Pevensey Bay was a place of quiet holidays and shingle beaches, a landscape defined by its wide horizons and the crumbling ruins of a Roman fort. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a young woman was walking toward a patch of shoreline known as the Crumbles, unaware that she was about to become the centerpiece of one of Britain's most baffling forensic mysteries. Her name was Irene Monroe. She was 17 years old, a shorthand typist from London who had traveled to the coast for a solo seaside holiday. Irene was bright, independent, and by all accounts, cautious. She had been staying at a local boarding house, and on that Thursday afternoon, she told her landlady she was going out for a walk. She was wearing a distinctive green coat, a striped dress, and a felt hat, a splash of color against the gray stones of the beach. She was never seen alive again. The following morning, a group of local children playing among the dunes made a discovery that would haunt the village for decades. Buried in a shallow grave in the shingle, just beneath the surface of the pebbles, lay the body of a young woman. Her face had been crushed by a massive blow, and a heavy, blood-stained stone, weighing nearly 30 pounds, lay nearby. It was Irene. The brutality of the attack stood in stark contrast to the sleepy, post-war atmosphere of the town. There was no immediate sign of a motive. Her handbag was missing, suggesting a robbery, but the violence used was far beyond what was necessary to steal a few shillings. As the local police scrambled to make sense of the scene, they realized they were dealing with a killer, or killers, who felt a terrifying sense of impunity. The investigation quickly centered on two local men who had been seen loitering near the beach that afternoon, Jack Field and William Gray. Field was 19, a former sailor with a reputation for trouble. Gray was older, 29, and an ex-soldier. Both were unemployed and known to frequent the local pubs. Witnesses placed them with a girl matching Irene's description near the Crumbles around the time of her disappearance. When the police brought them in for questioning, the two men were remarkably cool. They denied everything, providing a tangled web of alibis that placed them everywhere except the beach. However, their stories began to fray at the edges almost immediately. A local laborer came forward, claiming he had seen the trio walking together. More damningly, Field and Gray had been seen in a pub later that night, flush with cash they hadn't possessed earlier in the day. But the real breakthrough came from the science of the era. This was the dawn of modern forensics and the Nightingale Shore case, named for the proximity to the Nightingale farmhouse, became a landmark. Investigators found minute traces of blood on the men's clothing. Even more telling was the sand. Expert analysis of the shingle and dust found on Gray's boots matched the unique composition of the Crumbles beach. Despite the growing evidence, the trial at Lewis Assizes was a sensation. The defense argued that the identification of the men was flawed and that the timeline didn't fit. Field and Gray maintained a stoic, almost arrogant demeanor throughout the proceedings. They seemed convinced that without a direct witness to the act itself, they would walk free. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They described two predators who had spotted a lone girl, lured her to a secluded spot under the guise of showing her the scenery, and then turned on her with animalistic ferocity. The jury didn't take long to decide. In December 1920, Both Jack Field and William Gray were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Even as they faced the gallows at Wandsworth Prison in February 1921, the men refused to confess. They blamed each other in hushed tones behind the scenes, but to the public, they remained defiant. Next story, the University of Texas Tower shooting. Austin, Texas, 1966. The morning of August 1st, 1966 in Austin, Texas, began with the kind of oppressive, heavy heat that only a Gulf Coast summer can produce. By 11:30 a.m., the temperature was already climbing toward the triple digits, and the air felt thick enough to touch. On the campus of the University of Texas, the atmosphere was typical for a Monday in the summer session. Students were rushing between buildings with stacks of books tucked under their arms, and tourists were wandering near the main building, admiring the Spanish Renaissance architecture of the tower that loomed 307 feet over the city. The tower was the pride of the university, a limestone needle topped with a gold leaf clock face. It was a symbol of higher learning, visible from almost anywhere in Austin. But as the clock hands moved toward noon, that symbol was about to be transformed into a fortress for a nightmare that would forever change the American psyche. Earlier that morning, a 25-year-old architectural engineering student and former Marine named Charles climbed into a small car. He was a man known for his Eagle Scout background, his polite demeanor, and his military service. To those who knew him, he was the picture of an all-American success story. But inside his mind, a storm had been brewing for months. He had been visiting doctors, complaining of overwhelming headaches and unusual and irrational thoughts. He felt a growing, dark impulse that he couldn't name and couldn't stop. Before he left for the campus, the darkness had already claimed its first victims. In the early morning hours, Charles had ended the lives of his mother and his wife. He left behind a note, typed with chilling precision, explaining that he loved them both dearly, but wanted to spare them the embarrassment of what he was about to do. He wrote about a tremendous amount of hostility and a desire for an autopsy to be performed on his brain after his death to see if there was a physical cause for his actions. By the time he reached the university, Charles was heavily armed. He carried a footlocker filled with a staggering arsenal, a bolt-action deer rifle with a 4X scope, a 12-gauge shotgun, a .35 caliber pump rifle, several pistols, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He also packed supplies for a long siege, water, gasoline, food, and a radio. He dressed in a pair of overalls to look like a maintenance worker, allowing him to bypass security and haul his heavy trunk toward the elevators of the tower. At approximately 11:45 a.m., he reached the 27th floor. He encountered a receptionist, Edna Townsley, a longtime university employee. Without a word, he struck her, inflicting fatal injuries. As he made his way toward the observation deck, he encountered a small group of visitors, two families who had been sightseeing. He fired his shotgun down the narrow hallway, claiming more lives before they could even understand they were in danger. Charles then stepped out onto the narrow, wrap-around observation deck. From this vantage point, he had a 360-degree view of the entire 40-acre campus and the surrounding city. He was shielded by thick limestone walls with narrow drainage ports that acted like the battlements of a medieval castle. He was invisible to the people below, but everyone below was perfectly visible to him. The first shot rang out at 11:48 a.m. At first, the sound was dismissed. Some thought it was the backfire of a truck. Others thought it was noise from a nearby construction site. But then, a young woman who was 8 months pregnant collapsed on a concrete plaza. Her boyfriend, Claire Wilson, knelt to help her and was immediately struck himself. Across the mall, people began to drop. The sharp, rhythmic crack of a high-powered rifle echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed by the terrifying realization that the backfire was actually gunfire coming from the sky. For the next 96 minutes, the University of Texas became a kill zone. The shooter was a marksman. From his perch over 200 feet in the air, he was hitting targets that were moving, targets that were hundreds of yards away, and targets that thought they were hidden behind thin cover. He showed no bias in his selection. He fired at students, faculty, delivery drivers, and even people blocks away on Guadalupe Street. known locally as the Drag. History books often describe the scene as one of pure chaos, but there was also a surreal, frozen quality to it. Because this was 1966, the concept of a mass shooter didn't exist in the public consciousness. There were no active shooter protocols. There were no SWAT teams. The police officers who arrived on the scene were equipped with standard issue .38 caliber revolvers and some shotguns, completely outmatched by the long-range precision of the rifle in the tower. As the body count rose, the people of Austin did something that seems unthinkable today. Realizing the police were outgunned, local citizens went home, grabbed their own hunting rifles, and returned to the campus. They took up positions behind trees, cars, and stone pillars, and began returning fire at the tower. While this did not stop the shooter, it created a crucial tactical advantage. The sheer volume of lead hitting the limestone walls of the observation deck forced the shooter to stay low. He had to fire through the narrow scuppers or drainage holes at the base of the wall, which limited his field of vision and slowed his rate of fire. This civilian barrage likely saved dozens of lives by pinning him down and preventing him from taking careful, aimed shots at the people trapped in the open spaces of the plaza. Despite the return fire, the shooter remained a deadly threat. He managed to hit a police officer, Billy Speed, through a narrow gap between stone balusters. He struck a man who had simply stepped out of a clothing store to see what the noise was. The heat on the plaza was unbearable, and many of the wounded lay on the scorching pavement for nearly an hour, as anyone who tried to rescue them was immediately targeted. Inside the tower, the situation was becoming a desperate scramble. A few brave individuals decided that the only way to end the massacre was to go up. Police officer Ray Martinez, who had been off duty when the shooting started, arrived at the scene and immediately made his way to the tower. He was joined by Officer Houston McCoy and another officer, Jerry Day. Along the way, they were assisted by a civilian, Alan Crum, a 40-year-old retired Air Force tail gunner and manager of the university bookshop. Crum had been outside, trying to direct people away from the gunfire when he decided he couldn't just stand by. The four men entered the tower and began the slow, nerve-wracking ascent. They didn't know how many shooters were at the top, or if the stairs were booby-trapped. When they reached the 27th floor, they found the gruesome scene near the elevators. They continued upward to the small door that led to the observation deck. The heat inside the stairwell was stifling. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and limestone dust. Martinez and McCoy reached the top first. They stepped out onto the deck, moving cautiously around the corners of the square tower. Charles was crouched in the northwest corner, his attention focused on the people on the ground below. He was waiting for his next target. Officer Martinez rounded the corner and opened fire with his revolver, followed closely by Officer McCoy, who was armed with a shotgun. The confrontation was instantaneous and final. The 96-minute reign of terror was over. When the dust settled, the numbers were staggering. Including the shooter's mother and wife, 17 people were dead. More than 30 others were wounded, many with life-altering injuries. It was at that point the deadliest mass shooting in American history, a record that would sadly hold for decades. In the aftermath, the city and the nation struggled to find an answer to the most haunting question: why? Charles's body was taken for the autopsy he had requested in his final note. The medical examiner found a small tumor, a glioblastoma, about the size of a pecan, pressing against his amygdala, the part of the brain that regulates emotion and impulse control. For years, experts have debated whether this tumor was the catalyst for his descent into violence, or if the roots of his actions were purely psychological, tied to a difficult relationship with his father and the pressures of his life. The University of Texas Tower shooting was a loss of innocence for the country. It was the moment the public square ceased to feel inherently safe. It led directly to the creation of SWAT teams in police departments across the United States, as law enforcement realized they needed specialized training and equipment to handle high-ground snipers and barricaded suspects. The tower itself was closed to the public for many years. The bullet holes in the limestone were patched, and the blood was washed from the plaza, but the scars on the community remained. For decades, The university chose not to talk about it, hoping that silence would help the memory fade. It wasn't until 1999 that a formal memorial garden was dedicated to the victims, and not until the 50th anniversary in 2016 that a monument was placed near the tower, finally naming those who lost their lives on that sweltering August day. Today, the tower still stands as the centerpiece of the Austin skyline. Students still sit on the plaza, drinking coffee and studying for exams. But if you look closely at the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, you can still find the occasional chip in the masonry, a permanent reminder of the day the sky began to fire and the world was never quite the same again. Next story, the Diane Downs case. Springfield, Oregon, 1983. The night of May 19th, 1983, began like any other in the quiet suburban streets of Springfield, Oregon. But it would end in a scene of unimaginable horror, forever scarring a family and captivating a nation. Diane Downs, a 27-year-old mother of three, drove her children, Cheryl, 7, Danny, 3, and Christy, 8, home from a friend's house. What happened next, according to Diane, was a nightmare from which she barely escaped. She pulled her blood-splattered, bullet-riddled orange Datsun B210 into the emergency room parking lot of McKenzie-Willamette Hospital. Her clothes were soaked, her voice hysterical. "Someone shot my children. They shot my children!" she screamed, rushing into the ER, her 3 young kids bleeding profusely in the back seat. The scene was chaotic. Cheryl, the youngest, was already gone. Danny was barely clinging to life, a bullet lodged in his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Christy, the oldest, had a bullet in her brain, her small body convulsing, her future hanging precariously in the balance. Diane herself had sustained a gunshot wound to her forearm, a seemingly superficial injury compared to the devastation inflicted upon her children. Police were immediately called. Detectives Doug Welch and Fred Hughey arrived to a scene of profound tragedy and baffling questions. Diane, still distraught, recounted a story of a large, shaggy-haired man who had flagged her down on a deserted rural road. She claimed he tried to steal her car, and when she resisted, he opened fire, shooting her and her children before fleeing in the night. The initial shock and sympathy for Diane were immense. A young mother, a victim of a random, brutal act of violence. But as the investigation unfolded, cracks began to appear in her story, inconsistencies that gnawed at the experienced detectives. First, there was the crime scene itself. The Datsun was a mess of blood and shattered glass, but the exterior showed no signs of struggle. No forced entry, no signs of impact from another vehicle. And the rural road Diane claimed the attack occurred on, it was rarely deserted, even late at night. Local residents often drove that route. Yet, no one reported hearing gunshots, seeing a suspicious vehicle, or anything out of the ordinary. Then there was Diane's demeanor. While initially hysterical, her grief seemed to dissipate remarkably quickly. Within days, she was giving interviews, appearing on television, seemingly relishing the spotlight. She even posed for glamour shots, smiling, something that struck many as profoundly unsettling for a woman who had just lost one child and had 2 others fighting for their lives. Detectives also found her account of the assailant vague and ever-changing. The shaggy-haired man became less defined with each retelling. Her wound, too, raised eyebrows. A clean, entry and exit wound on her forearm, almost too neat, suggesting it might have been self-inflicted, a way to make her story more believable. But the most damning evidence would come from the survivors. Danny, due to his injuries, couldn't communicate. But Christy, against all odds, began to recover. After weeks in a coma, she slowly regained consciousness. Her memory, however, was fractured, pieced together in fragments. The detectives knew Christy was the key. They waited patiently, carefully, for her to be strong enough to speak, to remember. Meanwhile, they delved deeper into Diane's life. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Diane Downs was a woman driven by a fierce desire for love and attention. She had a tumultuous relationship history, a penchant for drama, and a recent obsession with a married man named Robert Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker, a former co-worker, had expressed concern about Diane's children. He had told her he didn't want kids in his life, a fact that would later become chillingly significant. Detectives interviewed Knickerbocker, who confirmed his relationship with Diane but vehemently denied any involvement in the shooting. He was shaken, disturbed by Diane's intensity and her increasingly erratic behavior. As weeks turned into months, Christie's recovery progressed. Slowly, painfully, she began to recount the night of the shooting. The detectives worked with her gently, using dolls and drawings to help her express what she couldn't articulate in words. And then the words came. Words that shattered Diane's carefully constructed facade. My mom shot us. The confession from a child, the sole eyewitness, was devastating. Christie described how her mother had pulled over, taken a gun from under the seat, and systematically shot her and her siblings. She recounted how Diane had then shot herself in the arm, a staged injury to support her narrative. The motive, as the prosecution would later argue, was chillingly simple. Robert Knickerbocker didn't want children. Diane, desperate to win him back, saw her children as obstacles, impediments to her happiness. She believed if they were gone, Knickerbocker would return to her. Armed with Christie's testimony and the mounting inconsistencies in Diane's story, the police finally had enough to arrest her. On February 28, 1984, 9 months after the shooting, Diane Downs was taken into custody. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The image of the all-American mother, transformed into a cold-blooded killer, gripped the nation. Diane, ever the performer, maintained her innocence, even after her own daughter took the stand and testified against her. Christie's courageous testimony, delivered with remarkable clarity and detail for a child who had endured such trauma, was the turning point. The prosecution presented a powerful case, meticulously dissecting Diane's shifting narratives, her strange behavior, and the physical evidence that contradicted her story. The gun, a .22 caliber revolver, was never found, but the bullets recovered from the children were consistent with that type of weapon. The wound on Diane's arm, forensically examined, was determined to be self-inflicted. The defense, led by attorney James Jagger, tried to discredit Christie's testimony, suggesting it was influenced by the police and her traumatic brain injury. They also attempted to resurrect the story of the shaggy-haired man, but it was a narrative that had long lost its credibility that on June 17, 1984, after an emotional and grueling trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on all counts. Diane Downs was convicted of 1 count of murder for Cheryl and 2 counts of attempted murder for Danny and Christy, and assault. The judge, James M. Maine, sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years. He famously told her, "You are a woman who is extremely dangerous, a danger to any children that you may come in contact with." But the story of Diane Downs didn't end there. In 1987, she escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, a dramatic breakout that ignited another nationwide manhunt. She was apprehended 10 days later, hiding in a home just miles from the prison. Her escape only solidified her image as a manipulative and dangerous individual. Cheryl was laid to rest, a victim of her mother's desperate obsession. Danny, paralyzed for life, was adopted by his prosecutor, Fred Hughey, and his wife, resiliently facing his challenges. Christy, also adopted by the Hugheys, went on to live a remarkably normal life, testifying against her mother again during a parole hearing years later, ensuring she remained behind bars. Next story, the Bobby Curly thallium poisoning. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, 1991. In the early 1990s, Wilkes-Barre was a town defined by its grit and its history of hard work. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, and the local university, Wilkes University, was a point of pride for the community. Among the many staff members at the school was 32-year-old Bobby Curly. Bobby was a man who seemed to have finally found his rhythm in life. He was a talented electrician, a newlywed, and by all accounts, a man who didn't have an enemy in the world. But in the late summer of 1991, Bobby began to suffer from a series of mysterious, agonizing symptoms that would baffle doctors and eventually uncover a plot so calculated and cold-blooded that it would change the way investigators looked at domestic homicides. It started with a strange tingling in his feet. At first, Bobby dismissed it as the byproduct of a long day on the job, crawling through cramped spaces and hauling heavy equipment. But the tingling quickly turned into a searing, burning pain that felt like he was walking on hot coals. Within days, the pain migrated up his legs. He became nauseated, his hair began to fall out in clumps, and his skin took on a sickly, translucent hue. Bobby was a strong man, but this unknown ailment was stripping him of his vitality with terrifying speed. When he was finally admitted to the hospital, his condition was a medical enigma. The doctors ran a battery of tests, looking for everything from Guillain-Barré syndrome to rare autoimmune disorders. Nothing fit. While Bobby lay in his hospital bed, his wife, Joanne, was a constant presence. She was the picture of the grieving, worried spouse, sitting by his side, stroking his hand, and tearfully asking the doctors for answers. Friends and family watched as she navigated the tragedy with a quiet strength, seemingly desperate to save the man she had married only a year prior. As Bobby's neurological system began to shut down, the doctors made a desperate, last-ditch effort to identify the cause. They sent samples of his blood and hair to a specialized lab. The results that came back sent a shockwave through the medical team. Bobby Curley wasn't sick with a disease. He was being poisoned. The substance found in his system was thallium. Thallium is often referred to as the poisoner's poison. It is tasteless, odorless, and colorless. Historically used as a rodenticide, it had been banned in the United States for decades because of its high toxicity to humans. It mimics potassium in the body, allowing it to slip past the blood-brain barrier and wreak havoc on the central nervous system. It is a slow, agonizing way to die, as the body essentially short-circuits from the inside out. The discovery shifted the case from medical emergency to a criminal investigation. But as Bobby's life hung in the balance, a second, even more disturbing discovery was made. Testing revealed that Bobby wasn't just exposed to a single, massive dose. The levels of thallium in his hair suggested he had been receiving small, consistent doses over a period of weeks, if not months. This wasn't an accident. Someone was feeding him poison day after day while watching him suffer. On September 23, 1991, Bobby Curley's heart finally gave out. He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by the very people who should have been his protectors. The local police, joined by the Pennsylvania State Police, began the grim task of retracing Bobby's final months. They looked at his workplace first. As an electrician at a university, perhaps he had stumbled upon old chemicals in a basement or a lab. The investigation into Wilkes University was exhaustive. Detectives checked every storage locker, every chemistry lab, and every maintenance closet. They found that while the university did have some old chemicals, there was no thallium missing, and more importantly, no one else at the school was sick. If the poisoning had happened at work, why was Bobby the only victim? They then turned their attention to the home. The dynamic between Bobby and Joanne was scrutinized. On the surface, they were the perfect couple. Joanne was a vibrant woman who worked as a nurse's aide, and Bobby was the hard-working provider. But as detectives dug deeper, the perfect image began to crack. They learned about tension over money and whispers of infidelity. Even more suspicious was the timing. Bobby's symptoms had worsened significantly after eating meals at home. However, the case hit a massive roadblock. There was no physical evidence linking Joanne to the poison. No bottles of thallium were found in the trash, and no paper trail showed her purchasing the substance. In fact, thallium was nearly impossible to obtain legally. The investigation stalled, and for years, Bobby's death remained an unsolved mystery. Joanne moved on, eventually collecting a significant life insurance payout and settling into a new life. But the investigators refused to let the case go cold. They were haunted by the cruelty of the crime, the idea of someone watching their spouse wither away while continuing to administer the poison. In 1994, a new team of investigators took over, headed by a persistent detective who believed the key lay in the hair samples. They used a technique called single-strand hair analysis. Because hair grows at a predictable rate, it acts as a timeline. By analyzing the thallium concentration in millimetric increments along a single strand of Bobby's hair, they could pinpoint exactly when he was poisoned. The results were a revelation. The spikes in thallium levels didn't just happen at random. They coincided perfectly with weekends and holidays, times when Bobby was home from work. Even more damning, there was a massive spike in the days leading up to his final hospitalization. This data effectively ruled out a workplace accident. The poison was being administered at home, in his food or drink. As the police intensified their pressure on Joanne's inner circle, the facade finally began to crumble. They turned their focus to Joanne's sister and a close family friend named Jack Burgess. Under intense interrogation, the truth began to leak out. It wasn't just Joanne. This was a conspiracy. The motive was as old as time: money and a desire for a different life. Joanne had become unhappy in the marriage almost immediately. Rather than seeking a divorce, she looked for a way out that would leave her financially secure. She had researched poisons and settled on thallium because she believed it would be undetectable. She had recruited her sister and Burgess to help her source the chemical and to provide her with moral support as she carried out the slow execution of her husband. Burgess eventually cracked, providing the most chilling detail of all. He described how Joanne would stir the thallium into Bobby's iced tea and his favorite soup. She would sit across the table from him, watching him struggle to hold his spoon with shaking hands, and then she would offer him another glass of the medicine that was actually killing him. The cruelty was breathtaking. Even when Bobby was in hospital, fighting for his life, Joanne was reportedly bringing him poisoned drinks to finish the job because she was terrified he might recover and realize what she had done. In 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne Curley was finally arrested. The evidence from the hair analysis, combined with the testimony of her co-conspirators, created an airtight case. Confronted with the possibility of the death penalty, Joanne did something that shocked the community once again. She confessed. In a cold, clinical statement, she admitted to the poisoning. She described the process with a lack of emotion that chilled the courtroom. She pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 10 to 20 years. The light sentence was a bitter pill for Bobby's family to swallow. They had watched him die in agony for weeks, only for his killer to receive a sentence that meant she would likely be free while still in her prime. The Bobby Curley case remains a landmark in forensic science. It was one of the first times that hair analysis was used so precisely to map out the administration of a toxin over time. It transformed a strand of hair into a witness that couldn't be intimidated or silenced. Joanne Curley served her time and was released from prison in 2016. She walked out of the correctional facility a free woman, having completed her maximum sentence. But for the people of Wilkes-Barre, and especially for Bobby's family, the name Bobby Curley remains a reminder of a terrifying truth. That sometimes the person sitting across the dinner table, the one who promised to love and cherish you in sickness and in health, is the very person waiting for you to take your last breath. Next story, the murder of June and Devaney. Blackburn, England, 1948. The night of May 14th, 1948, was unusually still in the industrial town of Blackburn, Lancashire. In the post-war years, this was a community built on the rhythmic clatter of cotton mills and the quiet resilience of working-class families. Crime was present, certainly, but it was usually born of desperation or drunken brawls, not the kind of unthinkable malice that would soon descend upon Queen's Park Hospital. At Ward CH3, a pediatric ward housed in a somewhat isolated stone block of the hospital complex, the atmosphere was routine. 6 children lay sleeping under the watchful eye of the night staff. Among them was 3-year-old June and Devaney. June was recovering from a mild ailment, nearly ready to go home to her parents. She was a bright, happy child, described by nurses as a favorite in the ward. As the clock ticked past midnight, the night sister and a student nurse went about their rounds. At 1:20 a.m., a nurse checked on the children. All 6 were tucked in, breathing softly in the dim light. But when a nurse returned to the ward at 1:55 a.m., the silence was broken by a chilling void. June's cot was empty. At first, there was a frantic, logical search. Nurses checked the bathrooms, the corridors, and the other wards, thinking perhaps the child had woken up and wandered off in a state of confusion. But then they noticed the details. On the floor, near the foot of June's empty bed, sat a heavy glass water bottle. It was out of place. More unsettling were the marks on the polished floor, faint, oily smudges of bare footprints leading from the open veranda door to the cot and back again. The hospital was plunged into a nightmare. Within the hour, the police were summoned. As the first rays of dawn began to touch the hospital grounds, a search party moved through the shadows of the high stone walls. Just 300 yards from the ward, near the hospital's boundary wall, a searcher made a gruesome discovery. There, lying in the grass, was June and Devaney. She had been brutally sexually assaulted and murdered. The cause of death was horrific blunt force trauma. Her tiny body had been swung by the legs against the stone wall with such force that the impact had been fatal. The shock that rippled through Blackburn was instantaneous and visceral. This wasn't just a murder. It was a violation of the ultimate sanctuary, a hospital ward. The perpetrator had bypassed locked doors, moved through a darkened room filled with sleeping children, and snatched a toddler from her bed without waking a single soul. Chief Inspector John Capstick of Scotland Yard was called in to lead the investigation. Capstick, a legendary figure in British policing often referred to as Artful Charlie, knew he was facing a predator who was as bold as he was depraved. The evidence at the scene was sparse but specific. There were the bare footprints on the ward floor, and then there was the water bottle. The glass bottle was the key. It was a standard 2-quart bottle used to fill the carafes at the patient's bedsides. When the forensics team dusted it, they found several sets of fingerprints. Most were easily identified as belonging to the nursing staff. But there was one set, a full series of prints from a left hand, that did not match anyone authorized to be in that ward. Capstick realized that while he had the killer's calling card, he had no way to identify him. In 1948, there was no national computerized database. Fingerprints were filed manually, and only if the person had a prior criminal record. After checking the records of every known local offender and finding no match, Capstick came to a radical, unprecedented conclusion. If the killer wasn't in the system had to be expanded to include every man in Blackburn. This was the birth of the first mass fingerprinting operation in criminal history. Capstick's plan was staggering in its scale. He intended to fingerprint every male over the age of 16 who had been in the town of Blackburn on the night of the murder. To the modern ear, this sounds like a logistical impossibility, but in the shadow of a child's murder, the community did not protest. They were terrified, and they wanted justice. The police began a door-to-door canvass that would eventually cover over 35,000 homes. They utilized the 1946 Electoral Register and local ration books to ensure no one was missed. Each man was asked to provide a set of prints, which were then compared against the marks found on the water bottle in Ward CH3. Weeks turned into months. The investigation was a grueling marathon of bureaucracy and ink. By July, they had collected over 40,000 sets of prints, and the Great Fingerprint Hunt was becoming a national headline. Yet, the match remained elusive. Skepticism began to grow. Was the killer a drifter? Had he fled the country? Or was he someone so seemingly ordinary that he was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the knock on the door? On August 11th, 1948, 3 months after June's death, a local officer named Frederick Gorton arrived at a house on Burleigh Street. He was there to follow up on a man who had been missed in the initial sweeps because he hadn't been home. The man was Peter Griffiths, a 22-year-old former soldier who worked as a local flour mill hand. Griffiths was polite. He sat down and allowed the officer to take his prints without a hint of hesitation. He seemed like a quiet, unremarkable young man. He lived with his parents and had no history of violence. He didn't fit the profile of a monster. The prints were taken to the makeshift laboratory where experts were working around the clock. When the card for Peter Griffiths was placed under the magnifying glass, the room went still. Every ridge, every whirl, every minutiae of the left-hand prints on the water bottle matched the card from Burleigh Street. Out of 46,253 men fingerprinted, they had found number 46,000 253. When police returned to arrest him, Griffiths didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply looked at the officers and asked, "Is it about the hospital?" In the interrogation room, the story of that night finally emerged. Griffiths claimed he had been drinking heavily. He described a state of aimless wandering, fueled by a dark, surging impulse he couldn't explain. He had scaled a hospital wall, found an open door, and entered the ward. He picked up the water bottle to use as a weapon if he was interrupted, but instead, he used it to steady himself as he reached into the cot. He told the police that June had woken up and started to cry. To stop the noise, he had carried her outside. What followed was a confession of such detached brutality that it sickened even the veteran investigators. He spoke of the assault and the killing as if describing a chore he had been forced to complete. The trial of Peter Griffiths began in October at Lancaster Assizes. The defense attempted to argue a plea of guilty but insane, suggesting that Griffiths suffered from schizophrenia or a temporary psychotic break brought on by his wartime service or his father's history of mental illness. They argued that no man in his right mind could commit such an atrocity against an innocent child. However, the prosecution, led by Toby Lowe, presented a different picture. They pointed to the calculated nature of his actions, the way he had navigated the hospital, the way he had avoided detection, and the fact that he had remained calm and functional for months after the crime. The medical experts for the Crown testified that Griffiths knew exactly what he was doing and that he knew it was wrong. The jury took only 23 minutes to reach a verdict: guilty. Under the laws of the time, there was only one sentence for a crime of this magnitude. On November 19th, 1948, Peter Griffiths was led to the gallows at Walton Prison in Liverpool and executed by hanging. The legacy of the June and Devaney case is twofold. It remains one of the most heartbreaking instances of child murder in British history, a reminder of the fragility of safety even in the most protected spaces. But it also stands as a watershed moment in forensic science. The success of the Blackburn mass fingerprinting proved that forensic evidence could solve unsolvable crimes, leading to the systematic filing and technological advancements that define modern policing today. Once the case was closed, the police did something unusual for the era. They didn't keep the 46,000 fingerprint cards as a permanent database. To honor the trust of the community that had cooperated so willingly, the police publicly burned every single card that did not belong to Peter Griffiths. They wanted the people of Blackburn to know that their privacy was respected and that the only thing that mattered was the one man who had broken the peace of their town. But for the Devaney family, there was no real closure. June was gone, a life extinguished before it had truly begun, leaving behind a story that began in the quiet of a hospital ward and ended by changing the face of justice forever. Next story: the murder of Margaret Cook. London, England, 1946. The fog that rolled through London in the winter of 1946 was more than just a weather pattern. It was the pea souper, a thick yellow-black shroud of coal smoke and industrial grime that turned the city's winding alleys into a labyrinth of shadows. For a city still picking itself up from the rubble of the Blitz, the darkness felt heavy, and the neon lights of the West End provided the only real sense of safety. But in the early hours of November 10th, even the lights of Piccadilly Circus couldn't reach into the narrow mouth of Blue Ball Yard. Margaret Cook was 26 years old, a woman described by friends as vivacious, with a penchant for the nightlife of St. James's. She was known to frequent the Blue Lagoon Club, a place where the music was loud enough to drown out the lingering echoes of air raid sirens. She was a woman of her time, independent, making her way in a city that was rapidly changing. But as she stepped out into the biting cold that Sunday morning, she was being watched. Witnesses would later recall seeing Margaret walking near the entrance of the yard, a small cul-de-sac just off St. James's Street. She wasn't alone. A man followed closely behind her. He was described as being of average build, wearing a dark overcoat that seemed to swallow his frame in the dim light. There was no shouting, no struggle that caught the attention of the few passers-by. There was only the sudden, sharp crack of a pistol, a sound that, in 1946 London, was still terrifyingly familiar. A nearby police officer, hearing the shot, sprinted toward the sound. He found Margaret lying on the cold cobblestones of Blue Ball Yard. A single bullet had struck her in the chest. As the officer knelt beside her, the life fading from her eyes, he caught a glimpse of a figure vanishing into the fog, moving with a chillingly calm, deliberate pace. By the time backup arrived, the killer had been absorbed by the city. The investigation into Margaret Cook's murder was immediate and intense. Scotland Yard took the lead, scouring the yard for evidence. They found a shell casing, a .32 caliber, and a single, chilling clue, a handwritten note in Margaret's handbag. It was a brief, cryptic message that suggested a meeting, but it lacked a signature. The detectives began to pull at the threads of Margaret's life. They discovered she had been living a double life of sorts. While she worked a respectable job during the day, her nights were spent in the company of the underworld characters that populated the West End. She had been seen with several men, some of whom had ties to the black market, a booming industry in post-war Britain where rationing was still a harsh reality. One name kept surfacing in the bars and clubs, a man known only as the Canadian. He was a frequent visitor to the Blue Lagoon and had been seen arguing with Margaret just days before her death. The police launched a manhunt, checking every hotel and boarding house from Soho to Chelsea. They found men who fit the description, but none who could be definitively placed at Blue Ball Yard. The fog had done its job. It hadn't just hidden the killer's face, it had erased his tracks. As weeks turned into months, the case began to grow cold. The sensational headlines that had once screamed the Blue Ball Yard mystery began to fade, replaced by the mundane struggles of a nation trying to rebuild. But in the files of Scotland Yard, the case remained open. Detectives were haunted by the cold-blooded nature of the execution. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Margaret's jewelry and cash were untouched. This was a professional hit. Years passed, and the 1940s gave way to the 50s. The murder of Margaret Cook became a dark piece of London folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in the corners of St. James's pubs. That was until a startling confession emerged from the most unlikely of places. In the late 1950s, a man named Robert Fabian, known to the public as Fabian of the Yard, retired from the force and began writing about his most famous cases. He revealed that during the investigation, they had come remarkably close to a suspect, a man with ties to a high-ranking official in the diplomatic service. The theory was that Margaret had stumbled upon a secret she wasn't supposed to know, perhaps related to the smuggling of currency or sensitive documents during the transition from war to peace. However, before an arrest could be made, the suspect disappeared, allegedly spirited out of the country by unseen hands. The implication was clear. The murder of Margaret Cook wasn't just a street crime. It was a matter of national security, or at the very least, a cover-up for someone far too important to be hanged at Wandsworth Prison. The gun used in the killing, the .32 caliber pistol, was never recovered. In post-war London, the city was awash with illegal firearms brought back by returning soldiers. It was a ghost gun, impossible to trace, much like the man who fired it. To this day, Blue Ball Yard remains largely unchanged. The cobblestones are still there, tucked away behind the grand storefronts of St. James's. If you stand there on a foggy November night, the silence feels heavy. You can almost hear the echoes of that single shot and the footsteps of a man walking away into the darkness. Margaret Cook was a young woman who wanted to live a full life in a city that had just survived its darkest hour. Instead, she became a footnote in the history of London's unsolved mysteries. A victim of a time when the line between the law and the shadows was as thin as the London fog. The killer was never caught, the motive never fully revealed, and the truth remains buried in the archives of a city that knows how to keep its secrets. Next story, The Secretary and the Senator. Wilmington, Delaware, 1996. In the mid-1990s, the city of Wilmington, Delaware, felt like a small town where everyone who was anyone knew each other. It was a place of high-stakes legal battles, political maneuvering, and a social hierarchy that felt almost impenetrable. At the center of this world was Marie Fahey, at 30 years old, and Marie was the scheduling secretary for Delaware's then governor, Tom Carper. She was widely loved, described by friends and colleagues as vibrant, ambitious, and possessing a smile that could light up the somber hallways of the state capitol. But beneath that polished, professional exterior, and Marie was a woman living in fear, entangled in a secret that was slowly suffocating her. The mystery began on the evening of Thursday, June 27, 1996, and Marie had spent the evening having dinner with a man at a local upscale restaurant. To anyone watching, they looked like an unlikely pair, a beautiful, young professional and a powerful, charismatic man nearly 20 years her senior. After dinner, they were seen leaving together. It was the last time anyone would see and Marie Fahy alive. When and Marie failed to show up for work the following morning, the alarm bells didn't just ring, they screamed. She was notoriously punctual and deeply dedicated to her role in the governor's office. Her family, particularly her brothers, knew instantly that something was wrong. And Marie was a creature of habit, and she was in the middle of planning a bright future with her boyfriend, Michael Scanlon. By the time Friday evening rolled around and her apartment sat empty, her family officially reported her missing. The investigation that followed would peel back the layers of Delaware's elite society, revealing a sordid tale of obsession, power, and a narcissism so profound it bordered on the pathological. Police began their search at and Marie's apartment. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no blood. However, investigators noticed a few chilling details. Her purse and keys were missing, but her passport and uncashed paychecks remained. Even more telling was the state of her mental health as reflected in her personal writings. Investigators discovered a series of diary entries that painted a haunting picture of a woman being psychologically tormented. In her journals, and Marie wrote about a monster. She described a man who was controlling, manipulative, and who refused to let her go. She wrote about her desperate attempts to end a secret 3-year affair with a prominent figure, a man who had used his status to keep her quiet and his charm to keep her trapped. That man was Thomas Capano. To the public, Tom Capano was the gold standard of success. He was a wealthy lawyer, a former high-ranking state prosecutor, and a political powerhouse who had served as legal counsel to governors. He came from a family of millionaire developers who practically built Wilmington. He was a father, a pillar of the community, and a man who seemed to have everything. But as the FBI and local police began to dig into Capano's life, the mask began to slip. When investigators first interviewed Capano, he was the picture of cooperation, or so it seemed. He admitted to having dinner with and Marie on the night she vanished, claiming he dropped her off at her apartment around 10 p.m. and never saw her again. But his story had cracks. He was overly talkative, trying to direct the investigation toward other leads, suggesting that Marie might have run away due to her struggles with an eating disorder or stress. However, the forensic evidence began to tell a different story. While Capano's home appeared pristine, investigators found that he had recently replaced a large section of carpet in his great room. He had also conveniently disposed of a large sofa. When they tracked down his brothers, the case took a turn into the truly macabre. The Capano family was tight-knit, bound by blood and business, but the pressure of a federal investigation began to fracture the foundation. Tom's brother, Gerard Capano, eventually broke under the weight of his own conscience and the threat of life in prison. He told investigators a story that sounded like something out of a noir thriller. According to Gerard, Tom had shown up at his house in a state of agitation shortly after and Marie disappeared. Tom told him that an extortionist had been killed in his home and that he needed help disposing of a body. On the morning of June 28th, the two brothers took Tom's boat, a 25-foot vessel named Summer Wind, out into the Atlantic Ocean, about 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. Gerard described a scene of cold-blooded efficiency. He watched as his brother hauled a large, heavy cooling chest onto the deck. When the chest wouldn't sink because of the air trapped inside, Tom became frustrated. In a moment of chilling pragmatism, Tom took a shotgun and fired holes into the cooler, but it still refused to stay under the waves. Ultimately, Gerard claimed, Tom removed the body from the cooler, weighed it down with a heavy anchor from the boat, and pushed Marie Fahey into the dark waters of the Atlantic. They then tossed the empty cooler overboard and headed back to shore. The betrayal of his brother was the smoking gun, but the prosecution still faced a monumental challenge. They had no body. In the history of Delaware, no one had ever been convicted of first-degree murder without a corpse. As the trial began in 1998, the courtroom became a theater of the bizarre. Thomas Capano, ever the egoist, insisted on testifying in his own defense. It was a move that legal experts called a disaster. Instead of the charming, wrong man he hoped to portray, the jury saw a man who was arrogant, condescending, and prone to outbursts. He admitted to the affair, but tried to pin the actual accidental death on another one of his mistresses, Linda Fairstein, claiming she had broken into his house and accidentally shot Marie in a jealous rage. It was a story so convoluted and lacked so much evidence that it served only to alienate the jury further. The prosecution, however, had a secret weapon, the cooler. Months after the disappearance, a fisherman had discovered a large, white Coleman cooler floating in the ocean. It was riddled with buckshot holes. When it was brought into the courtroom, the silence was deafening. Gerard Capano identified it as the one they had used. Forensic teams found a small trace of blood on the interior that matched Marie's DNA. The picture painted for the jury was one of a psychological predator. Tom Capano couldn't handle the fact that Marie was finally gaining the strength to leave him. She had started seeing a therapist, she was in a healthy relationship with Michael Scanlon, and she was beginning to see Capano for what he truly was, a narcissist who used people as playthings. When he realized he could no longer control her, he decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The trial lasted for weeks, becoming a national sensation. It exposed the underbelly of Wilmington's elite, showing how wealth and influence were used to cover up a lifetime of infidelity and manipulation. Capano's defense team tried to argue that there was no proof of a murder, only a disappearance, but the mountain of circumstantial evidence, the blood in the cooler, the missing carpet, the brother's testimony, and Marie's own word from the grave in her diary, was insurmountable. In January 1999, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Thomas Capano, the man who once walked the halls of power, was sentenced to death. The case didn't end there, though. Because of various appeals and changes in Delaware's death penalty laws, Capano's sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. He spent the rest of his days in a maximum security facility, a far cry from the mansions and country clubs he was accustomed to. He died of a heart attack in his cell in 2011, taking many of the specific details of that final night with him. The body of Marie Fahey was never recovered. The Atlantic Ocean kept it secret despite extensive searches. For her family, there was no grave to visit, only the memories of a woman whose life was cut short just as she was finding her voice. Next story, the Bobby Greenlease kidnapping. Kansas City, Missouri, 1953. On a crisp September morning in 1953, the French Institute of Notre Dame de Chaillon in Kansas City was settling into its usual academic routine. At approximately 11 a.m., a woman dressed in a well-tailored navy suit walked through the front doors. She presented herself with an air of quiet urgency, identifying herself as the aunt of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease. She told the sister in charge a heartbreaking story. Bobby's mother had suffered a sudden, massive heart attack while shopping, and she was there to take the boy to the hospital immediately. The school, moved by the woman's apparent distress and the gravity of the emergency, did not hesitate. They called for Bobby. The young boy, described by many as bright-eyed and trusting, was led to the front office. When he saw the woman, he didn't seem to recognize her, but in the confusion of a family emergency, a child's hesitation is often overlooked. He took her hand, walked out the front doors, and climbed into a blue station wagon. That was the last time Bobby Greenlease was seen alive by anyone who cared for him. Bobby was not just any child. He was the son of Robert Cosgrove Greenlease Sr., a man who had built an empire as one of the largest Cadillac dealers in the United States. In 1953, The Greenlease name was synonymous with wealth and the American dream. But that dream was about to turn into a living nightmare. Shortly after Bobby was taken, the school contacted the Greenlease home to check on the mother's condition. When a perfectly healthy Mrs. Greenlease answered the phone, the world collapsed. The realization was instantaneous. Bobby had been kidnapped. While the Greenlease family and the FBI began their frantic search, the perpetrators were already putting the next phase of their plan into motion. The woman in the Navy suit was Bonnie Emily Brown Hetty, and her partner in the crime was Carl Austin Hall. Hall was the mastermind, a man who had squandered a $200,000 inheritance on booze and bad investments, and was now desperate to reclaim his status through the most ruthless means possible. Despite the snatch going exactly as planned, Hall's desperation was eclipsed only by his cruelty. Less than an hour after picking Bobby up from school, Hall drove the boy across the state line into Kansas. In a secluded field, the unthinkable happened. Hall had originally intended to use a heavy-moving blanket to stifle the boy, but when that proved difficult, he used a small-caliber pistol. Bobby Greenlease was killed almost immediately, long before the first ransom note ever reached his father's doorstep. For the next several days, the Greenlease family was subjected to a psychological torture that few can imagine. Hall and Hetty began a series of communications, demanding the largest ransom in American history at that time, $600,000 in cash. In today's economy, that sum would be equivalent to over $7 million. The kidnappers were meticulous and cold. They sent letters and made phone calls, providing just enough detail to keep the family's hope alive while refusing any proof of life that wasn't general or easily faked. They instructed Robert Greenlease to pack the money into 2 duffel bags. The ransom was to be paid in $10 and $20 bills, making the physical weight of the cash immense, nearly 85 pounds of paper. Robert Greenlease, desperate to see his son again, complied with every demand. On the night of October 4th, following a complex set of instructions involving coded messages and remote drop-off points, the bags of cash were left near a bridge in a rural area. Hall and Hetty retrieved the money and fled to St. Louis. With the largest ransom in history in their possession, the duo should have disappeared. But Carl Hall was not a master criminal. He was a desperate man with a mounting addiction to alcohol and a penchant for drawing attention to himself. The pair checked into a nondescript apartment in St. Louis, but Hall's behavior was erratic. He began spending large sums of money almost immediately. He ditched Bonnie Hetty at the apartment and took a large portion of the ransom money, roughly half of it, and moved into a high-end hotel. He began buying expensive suits and hiring high-priced sex workers, drinking heavily and acting like a man who had suddenly struck gold. His undoing came in the form of a suspicious taxi driver and a police officer who noticed Hall's bizarre behavior and the sheer volume of cash he was carrying in his suitcases. When Hall was brought in for questioning, he initially tried to bribe the officers with thousands of dollars. It was a fatal mistake. The police, sensing something much larger than a simple case of public intoxication or bribery, contacted the FBI. Back at the apartment, police found Bonnie Hetty. She was passed out, surrounded by empty bottles and the remnants of their brief, grisly victory. Under interrogation, the duo's story quickly unraveled. On October 7th, Hall led investigators to the backyard of Bonnie Hetty's home in St. Joseph, Missouri. There, beneath a freshly planted bed of chrysanthemums, they found the shallow grave of Bobby Greenlease. The news sent a shockwave through the nation. The brutality of the crime, killing a child within an hour of the kidnapping and then continuing to extort the grieving parents for days, was seen as a new low in American delinquency. However, as the investigation into the recovery of the ransom began, a second mystery emerged, one that remains unsolved to this day. When Hall was arrested, he had approximately $300,000 of the ransom money in his possession, but $300,000 was missing. Hall claimed that the police who arrested him had stolen it. The 2 arresting officers, Lieutenant Joe Lewis McKnight and Elmer Burkle, were eventually investigated and brought to trial. While there was significant evidence of corruption and many believed they had made off with the missing bags of cash, the money was never found, and the officers were never convicted of the theft. The missing Greenlease ransom became an enduring legend in St. Louis folklore, with rumors of buried treasure and secret offshore accounts persisting for decades. The legal proceedings for Hall and Hetty moved with a speed that is unheard of in the modern justice system. Public outrage was so intense that there was no room for delay. Both defendants pleaded guilty. Just 79 days after Bobby was taken from his school, Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie Emily Brown Hetty were led into the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary. They were executed side by side in the same chamber on December 18, 1953. It remains one of the few instances in U.S. history where a man and a woman were executed together for the same crime. The Bobby Greenlease case changed the way America viewed kidnapping. It led to stricter security protocols in schools across the country and a renewed focus on the Lindbergh Law, ensuring that kidnapping across state lines remained a federal offense punishable by death. But for the Greenlease family, no amount of justice or legislative change could fill the void left by the boy in the blue station wagon. The Cadillac empire continued, but the name Greenlease would forever be associated with a tragedy that proved that even the most immense wealth could not provide a shield against the darkness of human greed.